They say that on the day they strapped Floyd Allen into the electric chair, the mountain their breath. Here was a man who had been a law unto himself, a patriarch whose word was gospel and whose pistol was the final court of appeal. He was a king in his own world, a world of misty hollers and unwritten codes of honor. Yet his reign ended not in a blaze of glory on a mountainside, but in a sterile room in Richmond, at the hands of a power he could never understand. Was he the last of the mountain lions, a fierce protector of his kin, cornered by a world that no longer had a place for him? Or was he a brutal tyrant, a man whose pride was so vast it consumed everything he loved, his family, his fortune, and finally, his own life? The truth, as it always does in these old hills, is tangled up like roots in the clay. Today, we're going to untangle that story. We're going to follow the trail of blood and honor that led Floyd Allen from the pinnacle of power in his mountain kingdom to that cold chair in the state penitentiary. And to do that, we have to start not with the famous massacre that sealed his fate, but with the forgotten gunfight 4 years earlier, the day the Allens shot up a courthouse and walked away, convinced they were invincible. Floyd Allen was not born a killer. He was born a king. His kingdom was the mist-shrouded hills and dark, winding hollows of Carroll County, Virginia, a world forged in the cold creeks and rocky soil of the Blue Ridge. In the late 19th century, this wasn't just a place on a map. It was a fortress of self-reliance, sealed off from the outside world by poor roads and a deep-seated suspicion of flatlanders and their laws. Here, a man's name was his legacy, and the Allen name carried the weight of generations of hard work, hard-headedness, and a fierce, unyielding loyalty to their own. His father, and his father before him, had taught him the only lessons that mattered. You didn't learn your worth in a schoolhouse, you learned it behind a plow, with an axe in your hand, or by looking another man in the eye during a land deal. The Allens were not poor. They were landowners, farmers, and businessmen who built their prosperity with their own sweat and ingenuity. Floyd learned early that wealth and influence were earned, and once earned, they had to be defended. Not with lawyers and contracts, but with a firm handshake for a friend and a cold stare for an enemy. Life in those mountains was a constant struggle, a teacher of hard truths. A failed crop could mean a hungry winter. A sudden sickness could be a death sentence without a doctor for miles. You learned to depend on two things, your own strength and the strength of your kin. When a neighbor's barn burned, it wasn't the government that showed up to help, it was the community. And when trouble came looking for you, it wasn't a sheriff you called, it was your brothers and your cousins. This forged an unbreakable bond within the clan and a permanent wall against the outside world, which they saw as weak, meddlesome, and utterly untrustworthy. There's an old story, perhaps a legend, about a young Floyd Allen watching his father deal with a dispute over a timber boundary. A man from outside the county arrived with a deed from the courthouse in Richmond, waving the paper as if it were a holy scripture. He claimed the Allens had been cutting on his land. Floyd's father didn't even look at the document. He just looked at the man and said, "I know my line, and you know my line. That paper doesn't know this mountain." He stood his ground, unblinking, until the man with the deed folded it up and left. The lesson for young Floyd was seared into his soul. A man's spine was worth more than his signature, and the only true law was the one a man was willing to enforce himself. From this upbringing, Floyd Allen carried with him a code as rigid and unforgiving as the mountains themselves. First, your blood was your nation. An offense against one Allen was a declaration of war on them all. Second, your honor was your most valuable possession. An insult left unanswered was a stain that could never be washed away. Third, you stood on your own 2 feet. You solved your own problems, you fought your own battles, and you never, ever bowed your head to an outsider trying to tell you how to live on your own land. This was the world that created Floyd Allen, and he, in turn, became its perfect embodiment. He was industrious, proud, and quick to anger, But he was also known for his generosity and unwavering loyalty to those he considered his own. He wasn't just a man living by the mountain code, he was the mountain code, walking and breathing. And he was walking straight toward a collision with a modern world that had no room for kings like him. Long before the newspapers in Richmond painted him as a monster, Floyd Allen was simply the most important man in his corner of the world. He was a man built like a barrel, solid and immovable, with eyes that could measure a man's worth in a single glance. When he walked into a room, the conversation didn't stop, but it changed. People straightened up. They knew they were in the presence of someone who mattered, a man whose favor could make you and whose anger could break you. He wasn't just a farmer scratching a living from the dirt. He was an empire builder in miniature. He owned some of the best land in Carroll County, acres of it, cleared and farmed with meticulous care. He ran a general store that was the hub of the community, a place where news was traded over barrels of crackers and bolts of cloth. He was a shrewd businessman who always seemed to be one step ahead, whether he was buying timber, trading livestock, or, as some whispered, running a profitable line in the untaxed corn liquor that warmed the mountain winters. He had built a small fortune through grit and intelligence, and he provided well for his own. But his influence went far beyond money. Floyd Allen was the unofficial law in his part of the county. If a dispute arose between neighbors over a stray cow or a poorly marked property line, more often than not, they wouldn't ride to the courthouse in Hillsville. They'd ride to Floyd Allen's porch. He would listen to both sides, his face unreadable, and then he would deliver his verdict. And his verdict was final. There was no appeal because everyone knew Floyd Allen had the will and the means to enforce his own judgments. To many, this wasn't tyranny. It was justice, swift, understandable, and delivered by one of their own. To truly understand the man, though, you have to look past the businessman and the enforcer. You have to see him at his own dinner table, surrounded by his wife and children, his brothers and their families. Here, the hard gaze softened. He was the undisputed patriarch, the head of the clan, but his rule was built on a foundation of fierce, protective love. His family was his fortress, the living, breathing heart of the world he had built. Every acre he bought, every dollar he earned, every enemy he made, it was all in service of protecting them. He was the sentinel on the walls of that fortress. This was the world Floyd Allen had built, a self-contained kingdom carved out of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a world of order, his order, built on loyalty, respect, and the quiet understanding that his authority was absolute. It was a peaceful kingdom, a safe harbor for his kin, and he would do absolutely anything to protect it from the encroaching world he saw as a threat to everything he held dear. But for all his strength, for all the respect he commanded, Floyd Allen was a man with a crack in his foundation. It was a flaw as deep and as unyielding as the mountain granite itself, a pride so absolute, so all-consuming, that it bordered on a kind of personal sovereignty. He didn't just think he was right. He believed in his bones that his will was the only true law. This wasn't simple arrogance. It was the conviction of a king who genuinely could not comprehend any authority higher than his own. They tell a story in Carroll County about a revenue agent who came up from Richmond one year, a young man full of ink and importance, carrying a list of new taxes. He found Floyd on his porch and began to explain the new regulations in a condescending tone, as if speaking to a simple child of the hills. Floyd listened patiently, his face a mask. When the agent was finished, Floyd didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at the man and said, "Your papers have no meaning on this land. You can take them, and yourself, back down the mountain you came up." The agent tried to protest, to invoke the power of the state, but he saw something in Floyd Allen's eyes that told him the conversation was over. That kind of pride, that unshakable belief in his own domain, was a force of nature. For years, this very flaw had been his greatest strength. It was pride that drove him to outwork every man around him, to turn rocky fields into profitable farms. It was pride that made him a man of his word, because the thought of his reputation being tarnished was intolerable. It was the source of the fierce loyalty he showed his kin. An insult to them was an insult to him, and his pride would not let that stand. He built his entire world on the principle of never backing down, never bending a knee. But this strength cast a long and dangerous shadow. It made him utterly blind to the changing world. He saw every legal summons, every warrant, every tax notice, not as the impersonal functioning of a government, but as a direct and personal challenge to his honor from a rival power. He couldn't distinguish between a man who insulted his family and a judge who issued a lawful order. To Floyd Allen, they were one and the same, an outside force trying to impose its will on his kingdom. This inability to bend, this refusal to acknowledge any law but his own, was a tragic flaw of classical proportions. It was a ticking clock, counting down to a day when he would be faced with a choice he was incapable of making. A day when the state would demand he submit, and his pride would demand he resist. A confrontation was not just likely, it was written in the very soul of the man. And that confrontation would be the engine of the entire tragedy to come. The spark that would eventually burn down the Allen dynasty was not some grand crime, no bloody murder or daring robbery. It was a piece of paper, a simple indictment from the Grayson County Court. The target wasn't even Floyd, but his brother, Sidney Allen, a man as proud and respected as any in the clan. The charge? Carrying a concealed weapon. To the state of Virginia, it was a misdemeanor. To the Allens, it was like charging a blacksmith for owning a hammer. In their world, a pistol was a tool of survival and a symbol of manhood, and the law had no business telling a free man what he could or could not carry. But this was more than a dispute over a law. It was personal. The Allens had been in a long, simmering feud with the local deputy, Mabe Poole. They saw his hand in this, believing the badge was being used as a weapon to settle old scores and chip away at their influence. The arrest of Sidney was not seen as impartial justice. It was seen as targeted harassment by their enemies. To Floyd Allen, this summons wasn't a legal document. It was a glove slapped across his face, a public challenge to his family's honor and his own authority as the clan's protector. His pride, that immense and fragile thing, could not let such a public effrontery stand. There was no talk of hiring a fancy lawyer from Richmond. The Allens' response was primal and immediate. They would answer the summons, but on their own terms. On the day of the trial in 1908, a formidable delegation of the Allen clan rode into the town of Independence. They weren't coming to plead for mercy. They were coming to make a statement. Floyd, Sidney, and their hot-headed young nephew Wesley Edwards led the way. They were armed, their faces were grim, and they moved with the cold confidence of men who believed they were their own highest law. The courtroom itself became a stage for this clash of worlds. On one side sat Judge Thornton Massey, the Commonwealth's attorney, and the handful of deputies who represented the fragile authority of the state. On the other, the Allens sat together, a silent, unmoving block of defiance. They were an island of mountain code in an ocean of common law. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the unspoken knowledge that the legal proceedings were just a formality, a prelude to a confrontation that had been brewing for years. The trial was a quick affair. The verdict came back as everyone expected: guilty. When that word echoed through the courtroom, it was more than a legal finding. It was a declaration of victory by the state over the clan. It was the law of the flatlands telling Floyd Allen, in his own territory, that his power meant nothing within these four walls. For a man whose entire identity was built on never backing down, on being the ultimate authority, this public humiliation was the unforgivable affront. It was the point of no return. The time for talk was over. In the heavy silence that followed the verdict, the world seemed to shrink to the four walls of that courtroom. For any other man, this was the moment to negotiate, to mitigate, to swallow his pride and pay the fine. A quiet word from a lawyer, a nod of acceptance to the judge, These were the off-ramps back to a peaceful life. The court itself offered these paths. Judge Massey was known to be a reasonable man. The sentence for a first offense of this nature would likely have been little more than a token fine, a slap on the wrist to assert the law's authority. But Floyd Allen did not see a row of open doors. He saw a line of bayonets. Every aspect of the legal process was, in his eyes, another link in a chain being forged to bind him. The clerk's scratching pen, the jury's averted eyes, the judge's solemn face, these were not instruments of justice, but weapons of humiliation. You could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his gaze never left the judge's bench. He was not a defendant awaiting a sentence. He was a king staring down a usurper. Some accounts say that even Sidney Allen, the man at the center of it all, hesitated. He was a practical man, and perhaps he saw the futility of this confrontation. A fine was just money after all. A few days in jail would be an inconvenience, not the end of the world. He might have been willing to bend, to give the law its small victory and live to fight another day. But he, like everyone else in the Allen clan, looked to Floyd. And Floyd's face was carved from stone. His pride had taken the wheel, and it recognized no road but the one that led straight ahead. The young men, especially the hot-blooded Wesley Edwards, took their cue from the patriarch. They saw his unyielding stance not as stubbornness, but as courage. They saw his cold fury as righteous anger. Floyd's rejection of compromise was a silent command to them all. We do not break. We do not bow. If Floyd Allen had shown the slightest sign of submission, his kin would have followed. But he showed none. His decision, made in the silent furnace of his own pride, sealed the fate of everyone in that room. Each tick of the clock was a step further down the path of no return. The opportunity for a quiet resolution vanished. The chance for a grudging acceptance evaporated. The air grew thinner, charged with an invisible current of violence. The Allens were no longer just a family in legal trouble. They had become a powder keg, and Floyd Allen's pride was the lit fuse. By refusing to accept the court's authority, he had rejected all possibility of peace. He had made his choice, not with words, but with a glare of pure, undiluted defiance. He had decided that the Allen law was the only law that mattered, and he was prepared to prove it. The moment the guilty verdict was read, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. This was it. The final crossroads. All that stood between the Allen clan and open warfare was the sentence from Judge Thornton Massey. And in that moment, the judge, perhaps sensing the electric tension in the room, seemed to extend one last fragile bridge back to the world of reason. He rapped his gavel once, a sound like a cracking bone, and prepared to speak. He could have thrown the book at Sidney Allen. He could have imposed a heavy fine and a long jail sentence to make an example of him. But instead, the words he spoke were measured, designed to de-escalate. He pronounced the sentence, a fine and a short term in the county jail. Some accounts even claim the jail time was suspended. It was a token punishment, a symbolic victory for the state that would allow the Allens to pay a pittance and walk away with their freedom intact. It was the law's final, surprisingly fair offer. It was the last chance for peace. For a long, agonizing second, that offer hung in the air. The whole world seemed to pause, waiting on one man. Everyone, from the nervous deputies to the Allens themselves, turned their eyes to Floyd. He didn't have to say a word. His face was the weather vane that would show which way the storm would break. He could have reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and ended the whole affair. He could have swallowed his pride just for a moment and saved everything. It was the logical choice, the sane choice. But as Floyd Allen stood there, he wasn't weighing a fine against his freedom. He was weighing submission against his very soul. In his mind, paying that fine was no different than kneeling before a conquering king. It was an admission that the law of the courthouse was stronger than the law of the clan. It was a public branding of his family as subservient. And his pride, that fierce and terrible master, screamed that death was better than such a dishonor. And so, in that final moment, he made his choice. He didn't shout or draw his weapon. The signal was far more chilling. He met the eyes of his nephew, the volatile Wesley Edwards, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was a silent, final verdict, delivered not by the judge, but by the patriarch. The verdict was war. The last door to peace had just been slammed shut and locked from the inside. As Judge Massey's words faded, the air in the courtroom became as thin as a winter razor. Then, from the Allen side of the room, a chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Young Wesley Edwards was on his feet, his face a mask of pure fury. His voice, cracking with youthful rage, cut through the tension like a thrown knife. "I'll see you in hell," he roared, "before Sidney Allen goes to jail." It was not a plea or a threat. It was a declaration of war. In that instant, the world for Floyd Allen slowed to a crawl. He saw a deputy, Mabe Poole or another man like him, take a single fateful step towards Sidney. It was a small movement, but in the supercharged atmosphere of the room, it was an act of aggression, a hand reaching out to put a chain on a king. The sound of his own heart hammered in his ears, a deep, steady drumbeat counting down the final seconds of peace. His hand, as if with a mind of its own, found the familiar cold weight of the pistol under his coat. A single sharp crack shattered the stillness. It wasn't a boom, but a sound as clean and final as a closing coffin lid. For a heartbeat, there was only the ringing echo. Then the courtroom exploded. It was a deafening, blinding chaos. Blinks of orange fire lit the suddenly dim room as more shots answered the first. The air filled with a thick, choking grey smoke from the black powder, smelling of sulfur and damnation. Women screamed, a high, thin sound that was quickly swallowed by the deeper roar of men's shouts and the splintering of wood as heavy benches overturned. Through the swirling smoke, the world was a series of terrifying snapshots. Judge Massey, the very symbol of the law, vanished from his high bench as if swallowed by the earth, scrambling for cover. Men who had moments before been instruments of the state were now just men, diving behind tables, their faces pale with shock. The courtroom, a temple of order, had been transformed into a smoky, claustrophobic battlefield where survival was the only law left. But the Allens were not panicking. They were a single organism, moving with a cold, terrifying purpose. They rose as one, not to flee, but to fight their way out. They formed a bristling line of steel and defiance, a human wall that no one dared to cross. Each man covered the other, their movements honed by a lifetime of absolute trust. They were not a mob, they were a clan. And in that moment of pure violence, they were magnificent and terrible. The few deputies in the room were outmanned, outgunned, and utterly outmatched by this unified front of cold fury. The storm of noise lasted for what felt like an eternity, but it was likely only a minute. As quickly as it began, it subsided. The last shot echoed, and a profound, ringing silence descended upon the room. The air was a thick, unbreathable fog, heavy with the metallic tang of burnt powder. The argument that had started with a piece of paper was suddenly, permanently over. Through the haze, Floyd Allen saw the wreckage of the law's authority, and he knew they had won. The thick grey smoke began to clear, not on a scene of carnage, but on a scene of absolute victory. Floyd Allen stood amidst the overturned benches and the lingering smell of gunpowder, his pistol still warm in his hand. He felt no remorse. Remorse was for men who made mistakes. He had made a choice, and he had enforced his will. He looked at his kin, Sidney, Wesley, the others, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes alight with the fire of battle. They were shaken, but unbroken. They were Allens. There was no thought of surrender, no consideration of waiting for the law to regroup. That would be admitting they had done something wrong. In Floyd's mind, they had done the only thing they could. He gave a sharp, curt nod to his brother. It was time to go. The business in this place was finished. They didn't run, they walked. With a slow, deliberate pace, the Allen clan strode out of the ruined courtroom, a phalanx of armed and dangerous men. Deputies and court officials, still dazed and disarmed by the suddenness of the assault, simply watched them go. No one dared to raise a hand to stop them. They moved through the panicked corridors and down the courthouse steps into the daylight, emerging into the gaping faces of the townsfolk who had gathered at the sound of the gunfire. Their path through the town of Independence was a corridor of fear and awe. People flattened themselves against walls, pulling their children back. The lawmen who were supposed to be the guardians of this town were nowhere to be seen, or they stood by, powerless and humiliated. The Allens walked straight to their horses, which were tied to a hitching post as if it were any other market day. There was no haste in their movements. They checked their saddles, mounted their horses, and gathered together in the middle of the street. For a final moment, Floyd Allen looked back at the courthouse, the symbol of the flatland law he so despised. It stood there, violated and silent. He had challenged it on its own ground, and he had won. He turned his horse without a word, and together the Allens rode out of town, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled back down on the defeated law. They were not fugitives fleeing into the wilderness. They were conquerors, returning to their mountain kingdom. The Allens rode home as heroes, their victory echoing through the hollows before they even reached their own land. To their kin and supporters, they were giants who had stared down the corrupt machinery of the state and made it blink. But this triumph was a poisoned chalice. While the men celebrated their defiance, the women of the clan now had to live with a new and constant dread. They had seen their husbands and sons ride off to a courthouse and return from a gunfight. From that day forward, every trip to town, every knock on the door, would carry the chilling possibility of reprisal. The victory at Independence didn't bring peace. It brought a permanent state of war. The community itself was fractured. You see, an event like this forces everyone to choose a side. There was no longer any middle ground. Families who had been neighbors for generations suddenly looked at each other with suspicion. You were either with the Allens and the old ways, or you were with the law and the future. Friendships soured, and old resentments flared into open hostility. The Commonwealth's attorney, Greer, nursed more than just a bullet wound in his arm. He nursed a grudge that would fester for years. The law had been publicly humiliated, and men like that have long memories. But the most dangerous ripple effect was on the law itself. Judge Thornton Massey was not a man to be cowed. The bullets that had scarred his courtroom had also hardened his resolve. The Allens had proven they were not just a difficult family. They were an armed insurrection against the very idea of a civilized society. For the judge and the prosecutors, the fight was no longer about a misdemeanor weapons charge. It was now an existential struggle for control of the mountains. They began to plan, to prepare, to ensure that the next time they faced the Allen clan in a courtroom, the state would not be the one to back down. The Allens' victory guaranteed that any future confrontation would be met with overwhelming force. The greatest wreckage, however, was invisible. It was the damage done to the minds of the next generation of Allens. The younger men, like Wesley Edwards, had learned a powerful and deadly lesson: that violence was a successful political tool. They had seen with their own eyes that a drawn pistol was more effective than any lawyer. This victory bred a fatal arrogance, a belief in their own invincibility. It erased any lingering respect for the institutions of the state and replaced it with contempt. They had shot their way out of trouble once, and now they believed they could do it again. So while Floyd Allen may have seen the events at Independence as a clean victory, the truth is that the gun smoke that filled that courtroom never truly cleared. It settled like a fine, toxic dust over the entire county, poisoning relationships, hardening hearts, and laying the groundwork for a far bloodier reckoning. The real tragedy of 1908 wasn't the gunfight itself, but the terrible future it made inevitable for everyone involved. After the Allens rode out of Independence, a strange and telling silence fell. There was no thundering posse, no call for the militia, No immediate cry for vengeance from the state. The reason was simple and stark. The local law enforcement had been completely and utterly broken. They had been outfought and humiliated on their own ground. To ride into the Allens' territory in the mountains of Carroll County would not have been a police action. It would have been a declaration of war, a war they knew they could not win. The law's first judgment, therefore, was a judgment of its own weakness. And so, the official trial of the Allen clan never truly happened. Instead, there was a series of quiet, face-saving maneuvers in back rooms. Warrants may have been issued, but they gathered dust. The Commonwealth's attorney, Mr. Greer, knew that serving them would cost more lives. In the end, the system blinked. The charges stemming from the riot were quietly dropped or settled with a small fine, likely paid by a third party, so that no Allen would have to suffer the indignity of paying it themselves. It was a humiliating whisper of a conclusion to a day that had roared with gunfire. The law, in essence, pretended it never happened. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was split right down the middle, cleaving the community in two. To the people of the mountains, to the families who lived by the same unwritten code, the Allens were heroes. They were seen as men who had refused to be harassed, who had defended their honor against a corrupt and alien system. The story of their victory was told around hearths and in general stores, growing more legendary with each telling. In this version, they were not criminals. They were martyrs to the cause of mountain independence. To the townspeople, the merchants, the lawyers, and the families connected to the court, the verdict was just as clear, but entirely different. To them, the Allens were savages. They were domestic terrorists who had desecrated the most sacred institution of civil society. They had replaced reasoned debate with brute force and the rule of law with the law of the gun. These people saw the Allens not as proud men, but as dangerous anarchists whose power had to be destroyed if the county was ever to move into the modern world. So, was justice served? By the standards of the state, it was a catastrophic failure. The law had been challenged by force and had retreated in disgrace. But by the standards of the Mountain Code, justice had been served perfectly. An insult had been answered, honor had been satisfied, and the clan's authority had been reinforced. The true verdict on the independence riot wasn't handed down by a judge or a jury. It was a verdict written in gunpowder and fear, and it declared for all the world to see that in these mountains the Allen Code was still the supreme law of the land. What of the men who stood for the law that day? What became of the antagonists in this story? In the immediate aftermath, their fate was one of profound and public humiliation. Judge Thornton Massey had been forced to take cover behind his own bench. Commonwealth's Attorney Greer had been wounded. The deputies of Grayson County had been rendered utterly impotent, forced to watch as a gang of men shot up their courthouse and rode away untouched. For them, there was no justice, only the bitter taste of defeat. But if the Allens believed they had broken these men, they had made a grave miscalculation. They had not broken them. They had forged them into something harder and far more dangerous. Judge Massey did not resign or transfer to a quieter circuit. He stayed. The bullet holes in his courtroom were a daily reminder of the day his authority was shattered by gunfire. The experience didn't fill him with fear, it filled him with an iron resolve. For him, this was no longer a matter of law. It became a personal crusade to prove that the code of the courthouse was stronger than the code of the clan. He would get his chance 4 years later in a different courtroom facing the same family. The other players in this drama were similarly hardened. Greer's wounded arm eventually healed, but the insult to his office never did. The deputies who had been so easily overpowered learned a critical lesson. You do not bring a handful of men to a fight with the Allen clan. The entire legal establishment of the region, from sheriffs to prosecutors, understood that the next confrontation could not be a simple legal proceeding. It would have to be a show of overwhelming force. And so, the antagonists in this story did not meet some poetic justice. They did not wither away or disappear. Instead, They prospered, and they planned. The Allans' victory and independence was the single greatest catalyst for their own destruction, because it united all their enemies and gave them a common cause. They had won the battle, but in doing so, they had awakened a sleeping giant. The law had been bloodied, but now it was awake, and it was watching, and it was waiting for the one mistake that would give it the chance to settle the score once and for all. The 4 years that followed the independence riot were the high summer of the Allan clan's power. Their victory didn't just fade into memory, it became the foundation of their living legend. Floyd Allan's authority, already immense, became absolute. His name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence from one end of the county to the other. His porch was no longer just a place of business, it was a throne room. In this brief, tense period, the Allans were not just a powerful family, they were royalty, and their mountain kingdom had never seemed more secure. But this victory planted poison seeds in the next generation. For the young men of the clan, the sons and nephews who looked up to Floyd, the riot was their defining lesson. They saw that the law could be faced down, that pistols spoke louder than gavels. They carried themselves with a new swagger, an unshakable arrogance born from the belief that they were untouchable. This sense of impunity would prove to be a fatal inheritance. The shadow of their family name, which had once been a shield, was slowly transforming into a target. The community did not heal. It curdled. The riot had been a political earthquake, and the fault line ran straight through the heart of the county. The old, easygoing relationships between neighbors were replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. People were careful about what they said and who they said it to. You were either a friend of the Allans or you were an enemy, and everyone knew that being their enemy was a dangerous proposition. The county wasn't rebuilding. It was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The silence in those hills wasn't peace. It was the quiet of a long, drawn-out ceasefire. And while the Allans reigned supreme in their hollows, a different kind of power was consolidating in the towns. The court, the sheriff's department, the Commonwealth's attorney, they had been humiliated, but they had not been broken. They were learning, adapting, and waiting. The power dynamic in the region had shifted into a precarious and deadly balance. On one side was the visible personal power of a clan patriarch. On the other was the slow, patient, and institutional power of the state. Both sides believed they were right, and both were now utterly convinced that the other could only be dealt with through force. The stage was being set for a final, tragic resolution. Today, the town of Independence is quiet. The old Grayson County Courthouse still stands, a stately brick building that keeps its secrets well. People walk its halls on county business, their footsteps echoing where Wesley Edwards once roared his defiance. Tourists might admire its architecture, never knowing they're standing on a battlefield where the law of the state and the law of the clan met in a blaze of gunfire. But if you stand there long enough, on a quiet afternoon, you can almost feel it, a faint, lingering echo of the chaos, the ghost of a moment when this temple of order was consumed by pure, unadulterated mountain rage. If you know where to look, you can find the other physical remnants of this story scattered across the hills. The old Allan homesteads are long gone. The cabins collapsed and reclaimed by ivy and rhododendron, leaving only a few tumble-down chimney stacks standing like lonely tombstones in the woods. And in a quiet cemetery, you can find the final resting place of Floyd Allan himself. The name on the weathered stone is simple, giving no hint of the storm that was his life. Here lies the king whose kingdom turned to dust, a silent testament to the fact that no man, no matter how powerful, can hold back the tide of the world forever. But the true legacy of the Allans isn't carved in stone or preserved in brick. It lives in the stories. The tale of the Independence Riot and the more famous Hillsville Massacre that followed has been worn smooth by a century of telling, transformed from a raw news event into a piece of local folklore. It's a cautionary tale told to hot-headed young men about the dangers of pride. It's a ballad of defiance sung by those who still feel a kinship with the old ways. Depending on who you ask, Floyd Allen is either a cold-blooded killer who got what he deserved, or a tragic folk hero who was the last king of the mountains. The man is gone. The clan's power is broken. But their spirit, that fierce, uncompromising and violent spirit of the old Blue Ridge, has not vanished completely. It haunts these mountains still. You can hear it in the stories told on front porches as the evening mist settles in the hollows. You can feel it in the deep-seated distrust of authority that still lingers in the hearts of some. Floyd Allen is dead, but the ghost of his name and what it stood for remains a stubborn whisper in the wind. So we come back to the question we started with, the one they still ask in the quiet corners of these mountains. Was Floyd Allen a hero or a villain? The truth is, he was both, and he was neither. He was a hero by the code of a world that was already dying, a world where a man's honor was his own to defend. By that ancient law, he was a righteous king protecting his domain. But he was a villain to the new world that was being born, a world of statutes and courtrooms that had no room for kings. His tragedy was not that he was evil, but that he was born a century too late. In the end, the Ballad of Floyd Allen isn't just a tale of mountain justice and courtroom gunsmoke. It's a profound and timeless story about how a man's greatest strength can become the very engine of his destruction. That unbending, iron-willed pride was the forge that created him. It made him a leader, a provider, and a protector. But that same pride blinded him to the changing world, and it would not allow him to bend, even when breaking was the only other choice. His story is a warning, etched in blood and gunpowder, that no man can stand alone against the turning of the tides. You cannot fight the future with a pistol, and you cannot hold back the world with the force of your will alone. And that, my friends, is the ballad of a man who tried to be as unmovable as the mountains themselves, only to discover that even the mountains, given enough time, must crumble into dust. Standing on the bank of Wallens Creek, here in the rugged heart of Virginia. Today, the only sounds are the water moving over stones and the whisper of wind through the sycamores. It's a peaceful place, the kind of place you might come to forget the world for a while. But this ground doesn't forget. If you stand here long enough, the peace begins to feel thin, like a blanket laid over something terrible. This is a place of echoes. This quiet creek is where the legend of Daniel Boone ends and the story of the man begins. Not the folk hero in the coonskin cap, but a father whose life was shattered right here on this spot. The story we think we know is a comfortable lie. The truth is soaked into this soil, a tale of such brutality it would redirect the course of a man's life and a nation's history. Today, we're going to listen to those echoes and uncover the story of the dark and bloody ground. In the autumn of 1773, this same wilderness was not a place of quiet solitude. It was filled with the sounds of a dream in motion, the groan of wagon wheels, the lowing of cattle, the shouts of men, and the laughter of children. This was Daniel Boone's grand gamble, the first organized attempt to bring settler families into the promised land of Kentucky. They were a small, rolling nation of about 40 souls, carving a path through a world that had, until now, belonged only to the Long Hunters and the native tribes. Daniel Boone wasn't the giant of folklore yet. He was a 38-year-old father and husband, his face already lined by the sun and hardship, but his eyes were fixed on a future he could almost taste. He saw Kentucky not as a contested battleground, but as an untouched Eden, a place where a man could build a life from the ground up, beholden to no one. He was a guide, a protector, a patriarch leading his flock into a new world. At his side was his eldest son, James. At 16, he was on the cusp of manhood, strong and capable, already possessing a quiet confidence learned from his father in the deep woods. He was Daniel's shadow and his legacy, the boy who would help him tame this new land. For James, This journey wasn't just about following his father. It was the great adventure of his young life, a chance to prove himself and to be part of the founding of a new society. The air in those early days of October must have felt electric with possibility. Every mile they pushed westward through the Cumberland Gap, the world grew wilder, more beautiful, and more their own. They were leaving behind the crowded lands and the rigid rules of the colonies. Out here, the only law was the law of survival, and the only king was the vast, empty sky. They were tough, self-reliant people, but they were not warriors looking for a fight. They were farmers, husbands and wives, carrying their most precious possessions, iron pots, family Bibles, and the seeds for next year's crop. They believed in the promise of the land, a promise whispered to them by men like Boone. They had no idea they were seen not as pioneers, but as an invasion, and that the land itself and its ancient guardians were preparing to demand a terrible price for their trespass. The whispers from this creek are powerful, but to give them a voice, you have to turn to the written record. The story isn't just in the soil, it's locked away in archives, in letters written by hands that trembled with grief and shock. I'm holding a copy of one such document. It's a letter from Captain William Russell to Colonel William Preston, dated October 12, 1773. The paper is a copy, but the original is as brittle as a dry leaf, the ink faded to the color of rust. This isn't just an old piece of correspondence, it is a dispatch from the edge of a nightmare. William Russell was another leader of the expedition, and his own son Henry was with James Boone that night. This is a letter from one father to the world, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. He writes of the search party and of the discovery. He describes the scene with the stark, horrified clarity of a man who can't unsee what he's witnessed. He calls the perpetrators inhuman and details how the boys were tortured in the most barbarous manner. This document is the key. It's the first official confirmation of the event, transforming local horror into historical fact. It verifies the location, the date, and the sheer savagery of the attack. It is a cold, hard piece of the past that proves the echoes here are real. But this letter, for all its terrible detail, raises a more profound question. It tells us what happened, but it doesn't tell us why. This wasn't just a raid for supplies or a swift, violent skirmish. The level of brutality described here was intentional. It was a message, written in blood. To understand that message, we have to look beyond the settlers' hopes and see this land through the eyes of the people who already called it home. To understand the horror described in that letter, you have to understand the land itself. To the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and the Delaware, Kentucky wasn't an empty paradise waiting for a master. It was Kentar-ten, the land of tomorrow, a sacred and vital hunting preserve. They didn't build their villages there, but it was their great commons, a shared cathedral of forest and meadow teeming with the buffalo, elk, and deer that sustained their people. Its borders were jealously guarded, and they called it the dark and bloody ground for a reason. When Daniel Boone's party of settlers snaked its way through the mountains, they were not seen as brave pioneers. They were seen as a plague. The Long Hunters had been one thing, solitary men who took some game and left. But this was different. This was a tide of axes and fences, of families and cabins. This was an army of permanence, an existential threat to a way of life that had existed for centuries. Every tree they felled, every patch of cane they cleared, was an act of war. Watching this slow-moving invasion was a war party, a coalition of Shawnee, Delaware, and Cherokee warriors. They were not a random band of marauders, they were the guardians of this land, men whose families depended on the game Boone's settlers were about to displace. They would have tracked the party for days, observing them with a mix of fury and contempt. The settlers' noisy, lumbering progress was an insult to the silence of the woods, a clear sign they did not belong. The decision to attack was a calculated one, and the decision to make it a spectacle of cruelty was a strategic one. They needed to send a message so terrifying that it would echo all the way back to the colonies in Virginia and Pennsylvania. They needed to turn the dream of Kentucky into a nightmare. When James Boone's small group separated from the main party, it offered the perfect opportunity. They weren't just going to kill the intruders, they were going to make their deaths a lesson. The barbarism Captain Russell would later describe in his letter wasn't mindless savagery. It was a deliberate act of psychological warfare designed to break the will of the invaders and burn the memory of this failure into Daniel Boone's soul forever. To understand a story this old, the paper trail can only take you so far. You have to find the people who have kept the story alive, not in books, but in memory. In a small town nestled in the Cumberland Gap, I found a local historian named Silas Blackwood. He's not an academic. He's a man whose family has lived in the shadow of these mountains since before Kentucky was a state. His knowledge comes from stories told on front porches, passed down from one generation to the next like a well-worn rifle. He looked over my copy of the Russell letter, his brow furrowed. "This is the white man's truth," he said, his voice raspy like dry leaves. "It tells you a storm came through and tore the roof off the barn. It doesn't tell you why the lightning chose to strike right there, right then." He explained that for 200 years, another version of the story has been whispered in these hills, a version that provides a motive far more terrifying than a simple land dispute. According to the tale passed down in his family, the war party wasn't just a random collection of warriors. It was led by a Shawnee warrior who was already carrying a deep and personal wound. The previous spring, his own son, a boy not much older than James Boone, had been killed during a skirmish with a party of white Long Hunters. For this man, the sight of Boone's settlers, an unstoppable wave of the very people who had taken his child, was not just a political threat. It was a personal desecration. This detail, passed down outside the official record, changes everything. The unspeakable acts committed on the bank of Wallens Creek were not just a strategic message of terror. They were a targeted, ritualistic act of revenge, a horrific mirror image of the warrior's own grief. It was meant to be a dark sacrament of an eye for an eye. It was designed specifically to make Daniel Boone, the great leader, feel the exact same hollowing loss that had destroyed his own life. The lightning wasn't random, it was aimed directly at a father's heart. On the night of October 9th, 1773, the air in the mountains grew cold. For the main body of settlers, it was a normal evening. Fires lit, guards posted, the familiar sounds of a camp settling in for the night. But miles away, a smaller group, including James Boone and Henry Russell, had separated from the others to chase down a stray horse and gather supplies. It was a routine task, the kind of thing these frontier boys had done 100 times before. They were capable, unafraid, and utterly oblivious that they were being watched. The war party had shadowed them for days, moving like ghosts through the forest. At its head, if the old stories are true, was a man whose heart was already a cold, dead stone. He was not just a warrior defending his land, he was a grieving father. And as he watched James Boone, the strong, promising son of the man leading this invasion, he saw not an enemy to be killed, but a debt to be collected. This was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to make the world balance again in the only way he had left, through pain. The boys made camp by Wallens Creek, building a small fire against the chill. They were young men full of talk about the future, about the land they would clear and the homes they would build. They were confident in their skills, secure in their small bubble of firelight, believing the deep, dark woods around them were empty. You can almost hear their last conversation, the easy banter of youth on the edge of a great adventure. They fell asleep under a canopy of ancient trees, dreaming of a Kentucky that would never exist for them. The attack was not a battle, it was an execution. It came in that disorienting pre-dawn gray, a sudden explosion of violence that ripped the sleeping camp apart. There was no time to fight back, only to be overwhelmed by a wave of silent, purposeful fury. Several in the small party were cut down in their bedrolls, their lives extinguished before they were even fully awake. But James Boone and Henry Russell were not killed. They were seized, dragged from their blankets, their arms bound tight. This was the moment that sealed their fate. The skirmish was over. The warriors had won. They could have vanished back into the woods, leaving the bodies as a stark warning. But the leader's eyes fixed on the captured boys. In that instant, the strategic goal of terrorizing the settlers merged with the raw personal need for vengeance. The son of the leader for the son of the leader. A life for a life, a wound for a wound. The decision was made. The remaining captives were quickly and brutally dispatched, but James and Henry were kept alive. They were shoved toward the creek bank, their pleas and struggles met with stony silence. The point of no return had been crossed. This was no longer about land or resources. It had become a dark ritual, a sacrifice to be performed on the altar of grief. And the dawn that was about to break would bring not light, but a descent into an unimaginable hell. Up on the highway, there's a historical marker, a simple metal sign that gives you the cold, hard facts, the names, the date, the event. It's an official scar, an attempt to nail down this ghost to a specific point on a map. But the sign is for passing cars and tourists. It sanitizes the story. The real marker, the real testament to what happened, isn't up there on the roadside. It's down here by the water. I'm standing on the creek bank now. It's a small, flat clearing, barely big enough for a few men and a campfire. The river stones are smooth and grey, worn down by countless years of flowing water. It's a perfect place to camp, naturally sheltered, which is exactly why the boys would have chosen it. This little patch of ground is the only physical evidence that's left. This is the stage. There are no monuments here, no weathered cross, no pile of stones to mark the spot. Nature has reclaimed it all. But standing here, you feel it. This isn't just a place, it's a crime scene. The silence is different. It's heavier. You can almost feel the weight of what this soil has absorbed. Right here. This is where it happened. And each of these smooth, silent stones is a silent testament to the chaos of that morning, a witness to an act so cruel that it would stain this ground forever. The fire on the creek bank was no longer a source of warmth or comfort. It had become a spotlight on a stage of unimaginable cruelty. James Boone and Henry Russell were bound, the last glimmers of hope extinguished from their eyes. Their captors moved not with the frantic energy of a raid, but with a chilling deliberateness, a sense of grim ceremony. This was not going to be a quick end. This was going to be a lesson. The work began. The first sound was not a scream, but a sharp, choked cry that was swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The violence that followed was methodical. It was not the hot-blooded rage of a battle, but the cold, patient work of men intent on deconstruction. The sounds that carried across the water were not those of a fight, but of something being systematically taken apart. The fire threw their silhouettes against the ancient sycamores, long, distorted shadows that flinched and writhed in a terrible dance. The sharp, clean scent of pine from the fire was soon corrupted by something else, a smell of scorching that was deeply, fundamentally wrong, an odor of violation that clung to the damp night air. It was the smell of something sacred being made profane. The boys' voices, which had pleaded and begged, had broken. Now, the only sounds were guttural, involuntary responses to a pain beyond the limits of language. It was the sound of humanity being stripped away, layer by layer, until only the raw nerve of existence remained. The warriors worked in near silence, their movements economical and precise, as if following the steps of a dark and ancient ritual. Then, a new sound. The heavy, rhythmic impact of wood against bone and flesh. It was a dull, percussive beat in the heart of the night, sickeningly methodical. A sound of absolute finality, repeated until it was no longer necessary. And then, the abrupt and total silence that followed was more horrifying than any of the sounds that had preceded it. The shadows detached from the trees and melted back into the forest as silently as they had come. They left behind a scene of profound devastation. All that remained was the whispering creek, the dying fire casting a weak orange glow, and two shapes on the ground that no longer resembled boys. A single leather moccasin lay on its side, yards from the fire, a small, lonely testament to a final, futile struggle. This was a story told with knives and arrows. Every wound was a word, every desecration a sentence, arranged to form a single, terrifying message. It was a message intended for one reader, Daniel Boone. When he and the search party finally arrived, they would not find the bodies of enemies slain in battle. They would find a carefully crafted monument to hatred, a masterpiece of revenge designed to do more than kill a son. It was designed to kill a father's soul. After the raw horror of a place like Wallens Creek, you come inside. You go to the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of a historical society where the past is filed away in acid-free folders. You look for the official story. Here, the chaos of that October morning is flattened, pressed between pages, and tamed by the formal language of the 18th century. You find depositions, journal entries, and the same letter from William Russell, now treated as a piece of evidence. The language is always the same. It's stark, formal, and designed to strip away the emotion. A report might state that James Boone, deceased, was discovered by the search party. It lists the names of the dead as if taking inventory. It describes the state of the bodies with a detached, clinical precision that is almost as chilling as the act itself. The report simply lists the cause of death as injuries sustained during an attack by hostile natives. Injuries sustained. It's a phrase meant to create distance. It doesn't mention the fire or the deliberate, methodical nature of the violence. It doesn't capture the image of Daniel Boone kneeling in the dirt next to what was left of his firstborn son, a man whose heart was just ripped out of his chest. The official record has no language for that kind of grief. This is the fundamental conflict of telling these stories. The documents give us the bones, the names, the dates, the locations. But they are silent on the most important truths. They don't record the sound of a father's cry echoing through the woods. They don't capture the cold, calculating fury of a warrior seeking his own dark justice. They record an incident, but they miss the humanity. And for the men on that expedition, the official record wasn't nearly enough. The law of the settlements was slow and distant. The law of the frontier was about to be enforced. There was no manhunt, not in the way we think of one, with a determined posse riding out in a cloud of dust, crying for vengeance. The reality was far more grim. After Daniel Boone and his men buried what was left of their sons in the cold, hard wilderness, the spirit of the expedition was broken. The message of terror sent from the banks of Wallens Creek had been received, loud and clear. They turned back. The dream of Kentucky was drowned in blood, and the retreat back through the Cumberland Gap was a silent, shuffling funeral procession. But the story traveled faster than they did. It moved from one isolated cabin to the next, a spark in dry tinder. The cold, official language of Captain Russell's letter was transformed on the lips of the frontiersmen. Injuries sustained became torn to pieces. Hostile natives became devils from hell. The names of James Boone and Henry Russell became a rallying cry, a justification for a hatred that had long been simmering. The law's pursuit didn't come from a sheriff's office. It came from the governor's mansion in Virginia. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, saw the massacre not just as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. The dry reports from the frontier were all the pretext he needed to unleash the full force of the colonial militia. There was no courtroom, no judge, no jury. The courtroom was the War Council, and the verdict had been decided long before the trial. The hunt wasn't for a handful of warriors. It was for the entire Shawnee and Mingo nations. The following year, in 1774, Lord Dunmore's War erupted, a brutal campaign to break the power of the tribes in the Ohio Valley, and forced them to cede their rights to Kentucky. Thousands of militiamen were mobilized, their resolve hardened by stories like the one from Wallen's Creek. The pursuit was a scorched earth campaign. The verdict was delivered at the Battle of Point Pleasant, a bloody, day-long engagement that shattered the tribe's resistance. The law of the frontier had rendered its judgment not with a gavel, but with the butt of a long rifle. The price for James Boone's life was a war that would change the map of America forever. You might think a story this important, a sacrifice this foundational, would have a marker, a stone cross, a simple plaque by the creek. But you can search the woods around Wallen's Creek all day, and you will find nothing. James Boone has no grave. He was buried where he fell, wrapped in a blanket, and returned to the cold, unforgiving earth of the wilderness he had come to claim. His only tombstone is this creek bank, and his only memorial is the story itself, a ghost that still haunts this patch of ground. The wilderness that promised him a future ended up swallowing him whole. His father, however, is not so hard to find. Travel 200 miles north to the Frankfort Cemetery, in the very heart of the Kentucky Daniel Boone opened to the world. There, on a high bluff overlooking the Kentucky River, is a grand, imposing monument. Carved stone panels depict scenes from his life, and a towering obelisk reaches for the sky. This is where they brought him back, decades after he died in Missouri, a man who had lost all his Kentucky land claims to lawyers and speculators. In death, the state he founded reclaimed him as its primary symbol. The irony is as deep as a mountain valley. The father rests in a place of honor, a tourist attraction where his legend is preserved in stone for all to see. The son, whose horrific death was the bloody price of that legend, has no resting place at all. One is celebrated, the other is anonymous, his bones long since surrendered to the roots of the sycamores. And what of the warriors who took his life? Their graves are scattered across a continent, the unmarked resting places of a people displaced by the very tide Daniel Boone unleashed. This vast distance between the father's monument and the son's lost grave tells its own story. It is the story of what came after the grief, the long, hard years of a man who had to carry the memory of that creek bank with him every day of his life. It raises the final, haunting question: what happens to a man who survives the unsurvivable? For Daniel Boone, the retreat from Wallen's Creek was not an end. It was a vow. The grief from that day settled into him, not like a soft sadness, but like a hard piece of iron in his soul. It became the fuel that would drive him for the rest of his life. He had to go back. He had to finish what he started, as if conquering the land that took his son was the only way to quiet the boy's ghost. 2 years later, in 1775, he was back, blazing the wilderness road and raising the walls of a fort called Boonesborough on the banks of the Kentucky River. But the world he built was not the Eden he had dreamed of. It was a fortress. The hope of 1773 was replaced by the grim reality of survival in a war zone. Life was lived with one ear, always listening for a sound that didn't belong, the snap of a twig, the call of a bird that wasn't quite right. The long shadow of that massacre by the creek fell over everything. Every time a child strayed too far from the fort walls, the memory of what happened to James would have returned to Daniel like a fever. The Shawnee had been forced to cede Kentucky by treaty after Lord Dunmore's war, but a piece of paper meant nothing when their way of life was at stake. The fighting didn't stop. It just became more desperate, more personal. The shadow touched Boone's family again in 1776, when his own daughter Jemima was captured by warriors and dragged away from the fort. Boone led a frantic, relentless pursuit and rescued her, but it was a terrifying echo of the past, a reminder that the war was never far away. The ultimate proof of that long shadow came 9 years after James's death, at the disastrous Battle of Blue Licks in 1782. By then, Boone was a seasoned commander, a living legend. But on that day, against his better judgment, he was goaded into a reckless charge against a combined force of British and native warriors. It was a slaughter. And in the chaos of the retreat, Boone's other son, Israel, who was fighting at his side, was shot from his horse. Daniel, under a hail of fire, tried to carry his son's body from the field, but it was too late. He had to leave another son behind on the dark and bloody ground. The cycle of violence that began on the banks of Wallens Creek had come full circle, claiming another of his children. The story of Boone in Kentucky is not one of triumph. It is a story of a man who won a country but lost a family. A man who lived the rest of his days under a shadow so long the sun could never truly reach him again. To most of America, the legacy that grew from that bloody creek bank is simple and clear. It's the story of Daniel Boone the Pathfinder, the brave frontiersman who faced down a savage wilderness to bring the light of civilization westward. In this telling, James Boone is a martyr, an innocent lamb sacrificed on the altar of manifest destiny. It's a clean, heroic narrative, the kind you carve into monuments and teach in schoolbooks. It's the story of a hero who persevered through unimaginable loss to found a state. But that's not the only story this land remembers. To this day, if you speak to descendants of the Shawnee, the people who were driven from their sacred hunting grounds, you will hear a very different legacy. In their story, Daniel Boone isn't a hero. He's the architect of an invasion. He wasn't a pioneer. He was the leader of a band of trespassers who ignored every warning to turn back. In this version of the story, the attack at Wallens Creek was not an act of random cruelty. It was a desperate, violent act of defense, a last-ditch effort to protect a way of life from being extinguished. And that's where the memory gets truly complicated, tangled up in the tale of the grieving warrior who may have led the attack. Was it an act of unprovoked savagery? Or was it a terrible symmetrical act of revenge, a wound for a wound? In one legacy, he is a nameless, faceless monster. In another, he is a father, driven to madness by his own loss, inflicting the very same pain that had been inflicted upon him. He becomes a dark mirror of Daniel Boone himself. So which story is true? The hero or the invader? The martyr or the trespasser? The hard truth is, the answer depends entirely on which side of the Cumberland Gap your ancestors stood. The truth is a matter of perspective. One man's pioneer is another man's destroyer. One man's tragedy is another man's last stand. The war for Kentucky didn't end when the shooting stopped. It continues to this day, fought not with rifles and tomahawks, but with the stories we choose to tell and the ghosts we choose to honor. A story this brutal can't live forever as just a set of facts. The human mind can't hold on to that much sharp-edged horror. Over time, it has to be reshaped. The pain has to be dulled, the events smoothed over, until the history becomes something else entirely, a legend. And that's exactly what happened here. The true, documented story of James Boone's death became the seed for 100 years of local ghost stories and cautionary tales. Locals will tell you not to camp by Wallens Creek, especially not in October. They say that if you come down here at dusk, when the light is failing and the mist starts to rise off the water, you have to be quiet and listen. They say you might hear something on the wind that isn't the wind, a thin crying sound. Some say it's the ghost of a young boy, forever lost, forever calling out for a father who came too late. Fishermen have talked for generations about a cold spot near the bank, a patch of air that stays chilled even on the hottest summer day. It's the haint of Wallens Creek, a permanent scar of sorrow left on the landscape. Over the decades, the story also became a tool, a boogeyman with a real name used by parents to keep their children close. "Don't you wander off," a mother would warn, "or what happened to the Boone boy will happen to you." The names might have gotten jumbled, the details blurred, but the core lesson remained. The wilderness is not your friend. Danger is silent, and it is always watching. The story became a fence, built of fear, to keep the next generation safe from the same fate. This is the final stage of a story's life. This is where history dissolves. The real James Boone, the 16-year-old boy full of hope for the future, is gone. In his place is a mournful spirit, a whisper in the trees. The complex, grieving Shawnee warrior is gone, replaced by a faceless shadow that stalks the woods. This is what happens when history is too painful to remember clearly. It gets turned into a haunting so that the community can forget the facts, but never, ever forget the feeling of that terrible morning. And so, we're back where we started, on the banks of Wallens Creek. The water still moves over the stones, and the wind still whispers through the sycamores. But it doesn't sound peaceful to me anymore. After peeling back the layers of history, of memory, and of legend, I understand what the echoes are saying now. The peace you feel here is a lie. It's just the silence that comes after a scream has finally faded. This isn't just the place where a boy died. This is the place where the myth of the peaceful frontier died with him. It's the place where Daniel Boone the man was forged, a man who would be haunted by this ground for the rest of his days. It's a story of grief, a story of revenge, and a story that reminds us that the history of this land wasn't a clean, heroic adventure. It was a messy, brutal, human tragedy, filled with fathers who lost their sons on both sides of the conflict. The next time you drive through these mountains and see a quiet little creek by the side of the road, or pass a forgotten historical marker, remember this one. Remember that these places aren't empty. They are libraries, filled with stories that are more terrible and more true than any legend you've ever been told. You just have to be willing to stop and listen to the silence. The boy is gone. The father's grief has long since turned to dust. The warrior's vengeance is forgotten. But the dark and bloody ground remembers. And the story remains. They said bullets curved around him in the air. They whispered that he could melt into the mountain fog like a ghost, that he'd made a deal with the devil himself in some dark and lonely hollow. For years, the name Jacko Fraser was enough to make a child stop crying and a grown man bolt his door at night. The law called him a murderer. But the people who lived and died in these hills had another name for him: the White Devil. But how does a man become a monster? How does flesh and blood turn into a legend that haunts a landscape for 100 years? Today, we hunt for the truth behind the ghost story. To understand a man like Jacko Fraser, you first have to understand the world that made him. Imagine the Cumberland Mountains in the late 1800s on the jagged border of Virginia and Kentucky. This was a land forgotten by God and the government, a place of stunning beauty and breathtaking cruelty. The mists that clung to the hollows hid deep secrets, and the ancient hills had seen more than their share of blood and tears. The Civil War had ripped through these communities, leaving behind not just poverty, but a generation of men who had been taught that the fastest way to solve a problem was with a rifle. They came home to find their farms in ruins and their futures uncertain. The law, in this part of the world, was a distant rumor. A county sheriff might hold authority in the dusty courthouse square, but out in the winding creeks and isolated cabins, his power faded to nothing. Here, a different law held sway, the law of the clan. Family was everything. Your name was your flag, your cousins were your army. An insult to one was an insult to all, and debts of honor were paid in blood. This was the era of the great feuds, like the Hatfields and McCoys, where violence was not just an outburst of anger, but a structured part of life, a grim inheritance passed down from father to son. This fierce loyalty was born of isolation. The dense forests and impassable ridges didn't just separate families from the outside world, they separated them from each other. Every farmstead was its own small kingdom, every cabin a fortress. Strangers were viewed with suspicion, and a man representing the government was seen as the biggest stranger of all. People here learned to rely on themselves, their kin, and their own judgment. But self-reliance couldn't always put food on the table. This was a world of grinding poverty. Families survived on what they could scratch from the rocky soil, what they could hunt in the deep woods, and what they could distill in a hidden still under the light of the moon. For a man with a quick trigger finger and no conscience, the desperation hanging in the air smelled like opportunity. It was into this boiling cauldron of pride, poverty, and clan justice that Jacko Fraser was born. The world he saw was not a place of laws and morals, but a battlefield for survival. The mountains were poised on a knife's edge, holding a fragile, violent peace. But that peace was about to be shattered, not by an invading army, but by a monster it had created in its own image. Long before the massacre that made him a legend, Jacko Fraser's name was already a poison whispered on the mountain wind. He didn't exist in a vacuum. His terror was fed by a network of lesser evils and silent supporters. Men like Henley Cox, his most notorious accomplice, were drawn to him like moths to a flame, lesser predators orbiting a greater one. And there were others, the small-time crooks who bought his stolen goods, the informants who'd trade a neighbor's whereabouts for a silver dollar or just to settle an old score. The Mullins clan, on the other hand, were the opposite of everything Jacko stood for. They were a large, well-respected family, a cornerstone of the community, which made them the perfect target for a man who wanted to prove that no one and nothing was safe. The deepest wounds in these mountains were often the oldest. Jacko himself was said to be a veteran of the Confederacy, a man who had seen the world burn and decided he liked the heat. He didn't come back from the war looking for peace. He came back carrying the war inside him, a personal battle against a world he felt had failed him. His grudge wasn't over a single plot of land or a stolen horse. His grudge was with humanity itself. He saw society as a sham, and he aimed to tear its mask off with violence. Of course, smaller, more personal grudges festered in every hollow. A card game that ended in a bitter accusation, a dispute over a property line that had been argued for generations, a family that got a little too prosperous for a neighbor's liking. These were the hidden fault lines running beneath the community. Jacko was a master at exploiting them. He understood the dark currents of envy and resentment that flowed beneath the surface of daily life, and he knew how to use them to his advantage, turning the quiet suspicions between neighbors into open fear. And so, the rumors began to spread, moving from cabin to cabin like a sickness in the air. At first, they were just unsettling stories. A peddler who was supposed to be heading through Pound Gap simply vanished. A farmer found his best mule gone, his tack shed emptied. A lone traveler would arrive at the next settlement pale and shaken, telling a story of being robbed on the trail by a man with eyes as cold and pale as a winter sky. None of these were big enough to bring the law down from the state capital, but they were carefully stacked, one on top of the other, building a foundation of dread. Every story, filtered through a dozen mouths around a dozen hearths, grew darker and more menacing. The whispers turned into a constant, low hum of anxiety that settled over the mountains. People began to look at the shadows a little longer. The sound of a horse at night was no longer a comfort, but a cause for alarm. The community was being slowly poisoned, not just by Jacko's deeds, but by the fear of what he might do next. The stage was being set for an act of violence so brutal it would turn whispered rumors into terrified screams. The year was 1892. For the Mullins clan, it was a day of prosperity. Several members of the family, including Ira Mullins, his wife, and other kinsmen, had made the long journey by wagon to the nearest town. They were returning home, their carts laden with goods, and more importantly, their pockets heavy with cash from a successful day of trading. We're talking several $100s, a staggering fortune in those mountains, enough money to set a family up for a year, or to make a desperate man do the unthinkable. Imagine the scene. A narrow mountain path, barely wide enough for their wagons, snaking its way through the dense, dark woods of Pound Gap. The late afternoon sun was beginning to fail, casting long, distorted shadows that clawed at the edges of the trail. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The steady creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of the horses were the only sounds in a world that was growing unnaturally quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The woods were holding their breath. It was a feeling every mountain person knows in their bones. The difference between a peaceful silence and a waiting one. Perhaps one of the men glanced nervously into the darkening trees. Perhaps a child in the wagon pulled a blanket a little tighter around their shoulders, sensing a shift in the air. They were on their own land, just miles from the safety of their homes. But that feeling of safety was beginning to fray like an old rope. They were being watched. Suddenly, from the deep shadows of the forest, a command rang out, a harsh voice slicing through the quiet, telling them to halt. But this wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. Before the echo had even died, the trees erupted in a blaze of rifle fire. The led horse screamed and reared, falling in its traces. The quiet evening was shattered by the roar of guns, the splintering of wood, and the first cries of shock and pain. They say that for 5 days in the late summer of 1921, the hills of West Virginia went to war with themselves. The hollows of Blair Mountain echoed with the thunder of 1,000,000 rounds fired as the largest armed uprising in American history since the Civil War reached its bloody climax. And standing against the tide of 10,000 Union miners was one man, a county sheriff named Don Chaffin. He met them not with a posse, but with a private army, machine gun nests, and even airplanes dropping homemade bombs from the sky. How does a man born and raised in these same mountains come to wage war against his own people? Was he a villain, a corrupt tyrant in the pocket of the coal barons, crushing the common man under his boot? Or was he, in his own mind, the last line of defense for law and order, a king protecting his county from an invading mob? The truth, as it always does in Appalachia, lies buried deep in the shadows between fact and legend. Today, we dig for it. We trace the path that turned a small-town lawman into the absolute ruler of Logan County. Don Chaffin was no outsider. He was born in 1887, a son of Logan County, with roots that ran as deep in that rocky soil as any oak tree. The Chaffins were one of the founding families, their name carrying weight long before the first coal tipples scarred the landscape. He grew up breathing mountain air, learning the unwritten laws of the hollows, that loyalty to kin was absolute, that an insult to your name had to be answered, and that the only justice you could truly count on was the one you made for yourself. He was one of them, fluent in the language of both the front porch and the family feud. But the world Chaffin was born into was dying. The old Appalachia of scattered homesteads and fierce independence was being swallowed whole by an industrial giant. King Coal was the new god, and the coal companies were its high priests. They brought jobs, yes, but they also brought a new kind of servitude. They owned the houses the miners lived in, the stores where they bought their food, and the politicians who wrote the laws. Young Don Chaffin saw this firsthand. He saw proud men who once answered to no one, transformed into something less, their lives dictated by the shrill blast of a mine whistle. He began his career as a school teacher, a respected position in any mountain community. For a time, he stood before the children of Logan County, trying to impart lessons from a book. But he quickly learned a more potent lesson himself. He saw that the real power wasn't in the schoolhouse, it was in the courthouse. It was held by the men who could levy a tax, deputize a friend, or make a troublesome problem disappear with a quiet word and a nod. He saw that knowledge was one thing, but control was everything. This realization became the forge for his character. A choice was laid before him. He could remain a man of the old mountains, honorable but ultimately powerless, destined to be swept aside by the forces of industry. Or he could become a man of the new Appalachia, He could learn to master the machinery of this new world, to wield its power, and to bend it to his will. The ambition in his heart was too strong to ignore. He made his choice. He decided he would not be a subject in the kingdom of coal. He would be its king. The old mountain code of loyalty was still there, but he twisted it. His ultimate loyalty would no longer be just to his family name, but to the preservation of his own power. He would trade the quiet respect of the schoolhouse for the cold, hard fear commanded by the man in the sheriff's office. This was the moment Don Chaffin the teacher died, and Don Chaffin the tyrant began to take shape. Long before the battle that would make him infamous, Don Chaffin was simply the most powerful man in southern West Virginia. To see him in his prime, strolling down the streets of Logan, you wouldn't necessarily see a tyrant. You'd see a man of influence, dressed immaculately in a fine suit and hat, his pearl-handled pistols a subtle but constant reminder of his authority. He had a smile that could charm a bird from a tree and eyes that missed nothing. He was the sun around which Logan County orbited, and he held his position not just through force, but through a deep, personal understanding of its people. For those who stayed on his right side, Sheriff Chaffin could be a powerful ally. He was the man you went to when you had a problem the law books couldn't solve. A dispute over a property line, a son who'd gotten into a bit of trouble, a family facing hard times, Chaffin could fix it with a word. He cultivated a network of loyalty, a system of patronage where he was the benevolent patriarch, dispensing favors and expecting absolute allegiance in return. In a place where official government was often distant and ineffective, Don Chaffin was the man who got things done. At home, he was a husband and a father. He built a life of comfort and privilege for his family, a world away from the grit and danger of the coal mines that funded it. This, perhaps, was the world he was truly protecting. Not just the abstract profits of the coal operators, but the safety and prosperity of his own kin. Every action he took, every line he drew in the dirt, was to insulate his family from the chaos and poverty that surrounded them. He was building a dynasty on a foundation of coal, and he would let no one threaten it. This was the kingdom Don Chaffin built, a county sealed off from the outside world, running on his rules. It was a place of brutal, enforced order. The coal trains ran on time, the company payrolls were met, and the union agitators were kept on the other side of the county line. To the coal barons in their distant city offices, it was a perfect model of efficiency. To the miners who kept their heads down and did their work, it was a life, a hard life, but a predictable one. Don Chaffin ensured that predictability, and in the turbulent world of the coal fields, that was a powerful commodity. But every king has a weakness, and Don Chaffin's was a profound and blinding one. He could not tolerate a single challenge to his authority. It wasn't just pride, and it was more than mere stubbornness. It was a fundamental belief that Logan County was a direct extension of his own will. In his mind, he had built an orderly kingdom from the chaos of the mountains, and any voice of dissent was not just a disagreement, it was an act of treason. He saw the world in absolutes. You were either with him, or you were an enemy to be crushed. This flaw was on display long before the miners marched. You saw it in the cold, efficient brutality of what became known as the Logan County system. When a man suspected of Union sympathies stepped off the train, there was no debate. There was no argument. Chaffin's deputies, his private army, would simply surround him. The choice was never about ideas, it was about survival. Leave now on the next train, or be carried out after a beating that would serve as a lesson to anyone else foolish enough to try. This wasn't law enforcement, it was the purging of an infection. For years, this iron-fisted approach was the very source of his strength. The coal operators paid him a fortune precisely because he was uncompromising. He was the wall that kept the union out, the guarantee that their profits would continue to flow, uninterrupted by strikes or demands for better pay. His fatal flaw was the very thing that made him rich and powerful. He built his castle on the bedrock of his own intolerance. But a wall built to keep out a few men cannot hold back a flood. Chafin's vision was fatally narrow, limited to the borders of his own county. He failed to understand that the union movement was becoming something more than just a few organizers he could intimidate. It was an idea, spreading like wildfire through the desperate and oppressed coal camps. He believed he could beat that idea into submission, just as he had beaten individual men. He could not conceive of a world where his control was not absolute. He could not imagine a negotiation, a compromise, or a shared power. In Don Chafin's mind, there was only room for one king in Logan County. And as the anger in the surrounding coalfields began to smolder and grow, this fatal crack in his armor was about to be struck by the force of an entire army. He was a man who knew only how to push back, and he was about to be pushed by a force greater than any he had ever known. The spark that lit the Appalachian powder keg didn't land in Logan County. It landed a few counties over, on the stone steps of the McDowell County Courthouse, and it came in the form of an assassination. The target was a man named Sid Hatfield, the chief of police of Matawan. To the Union miners, Hatfield was more than a lawman. He was a folk hero, a living legend. Where Don Chafin was the symbol of company control, Hatfield was the symbol of defiance. He was the one lawman who had stood with his people, famously facing down Baldwin Felts agents in a bloody shootout that became known as the Matawan Massacre. He was proof that not every man with a badge was for sale. On August the 1st, 1921, Hatfield arrived at the courthouse in Welch to face trumped-up charges, a legal trap set by his enemies. He was unarmed, walking beside his wife, trusting in the sanctity of the law he represented. As he climbed the steps, Baldwin Felts agents, the very same men he had fought in Matawan, were waiting. They opened fire in broad daylight, cutting him down in a hail of bullets right in front of his wife. His friend Ed Chambers was executed alongside him. It was not a gunfight. It was a public execution. The news spread through the coal camps, not like a whisper, but like a physical blow. This was the ultimate act of treachery. It was one thing to be cheated at the company store or beaten by deputies in a dark hollow. It was another to see your one hope for justice within the system murdered on the very steps of a courthouse. The message sent by the coal operators was clear and brutal. There is no law for you here. There is no protection. We can kill your heroes in the open, and nothing will be done. For Don Chafin, this act was happening in another county, perpetrated by men not directly on his payroll. But in the hearts and minds of the miners, it was all part of the same corrupt, violent machine of which he was the master architect. Their rage, their grief, and their years of simmering desperation finally crystallized into a single, unifying purpose. The system had declared war on them, so they would declare war on the system. And the symbol of that system, its beating heart and its iron fist, was Sheriff Don Chafin. This was the unforgivable affront. The miners began to gather, not for a strike, but for a crusade. They tied red bandanas around their necks, a symbol of their solidarity that would give them the name Rednecks. They cleaned their rifles, gathered their ammunition, and began to march south. Their goal was no longer just to unionize a county. It was to avenge a martyr, to tear down a kingdom, and to bring their own form of justice to the man who represented everything they hated. The fuse was lit, and it was burning straight for Logan County. As the news of the marching army reached Logan, the state capital of Charleston descended into a panic. Governor Ephraim Morgan, a man caught between the immense power of the coal industry and the terrifying prospect of a civil war, pleaded for calm. He sent telegrams, issued proclamations, and dispatched the state police, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a handful of sand. He knew that the only two men who could truly stop this were the leaders of the Miners' March and the sheriff of Logan County. Federal mediators were sent, including the decorated General Billy Mitchell. They met with the miners' leaders who, for all their rage, laid out their terms. They wanted the violence to end. They wanted the right to join a union without being beaten or killed. They wanted the Logan County system dismantled. They were willing to talk, but they would not turn back until their basic rights as American citizens were guaranteed. The government, it seemed, was trying to find a way out, a path that didn't lead over the top of Blair Mountain. But for Don Chaffin, there was nothing to discuss. From his command post in Logan, he watched the situation not as a political crisis, but as a military operation. To him, the 10,000 approaching men were not desperate workers seeking justice. They were an invading army, a horde of Bolsheviks and insurrectionists bent on destroying his county. The governor's pleas for negotiation were, in his eyes, signs of weakness. You don't negotiate with a mob, you break it. While others talked of peace, Chaffin prepared for war. The coal operators opened their coffers, and Chaffin spent the money with deadly efficiency. He put out the call, and his army of deputies swelled from hundreds to nearly 3,000. Gun thugs, mercenaries, and strikebreakers poured into Logan, men who were paid to shoot, not to talk. Rifles and machine guns, purchased by the ton, were trucked in and distributed. The phone lines between Logan and the coal company offices hummed with logistics, not diplomacy. He rejected every attempt at de-escalation. When state officials suggested he allow a small, peaceful delegation of miners to enter Logan to present their grievances, he refused. When federal mediators proposed a ceasefire and a cooling-off period, he ignored them. His response was to send his men into the hills. He directed them to dig trenches, set up machine gun nests, and turn the 10-mile ridge of Blair Mountain into a fortress. Every shovel of dirt thrown, every strand of barbed wire unspooled was Don Chaffin's answer to the calls for peace. He was making his stand, not just for the coal companies, but for his own absolute, unquestioned rule. He had locked and bolted every door that led to compromise, leaving only one path open, the path of violence. The wires between Logan County and Washington, D.C. were humming. President Warren G. Harding, seeing a domestic war about to explode, made one last desperate attempt to pull the combatants back from the brink. He sent a direct message, a final ultimatum, not just to the marching miners, but to Don Chaffin himself. The offer was clear. The miners had agreed to halt their advance if, and only if, Chaffin's private army was disarmed and disbanded. Federal troops would be sent in, not to fight the miners, but to act as a neutral peacekeeping force. It was a clear off-ramp, a path away from the abyss, laid at his feet by the President of the United States. Imagine Don Chaffin in his office, the telegram in his hand. The air is thick with the smell of gun oil and nervous sweat. Outside, the town of Logan is an armed camp, his men preparing for the fight of their lives. For a moment, he must have weighed his options. On one side was the full might of the federal government, a power that could crush him without a second thought. Accepting the deal would mean survival. He would lose his private army, yes, and his absolute power would be broken, but he would live. He would see his family again. The war would be over before a shot was fired. But then he would have considered the other side of the coin. To stand down now would be to surrender. It would mean that the threats and the rage of the Union men had succeeded. It would be a public admission that his authority, the very foundation of his identity, had limits. The image of federal troops policing his county while the men who had marched to hang him were allowed to walk free must have been a vision of pure humiliation. It was a direct challenge to his fatal flaw, his belief in his own absolute control. He stood at the final crossroads. One path led to a diminished future, the other led over Blair Mountain. He looked at the telegram, the last chance for peace, a direct order from his president. Then he looked at the map on his wall, at the red pins marking his machine gun emplacements along the ridge. He made his choice. He set the telegram aside. He picked up his telephone and gave an order not to stand down, but to double the patrols at the key mountain passes. He told his commanders that the line had been drawn and that any man wearing a red bandana who tried to cross it was to be met with overwhelming force. The last bridge to peace was burned. In that moment, Don Chaffin ceased to be a sheriff defending his county. He became a king, choosing war over the surrender of his crown. The first report came over a crackling field telephone line, a scout's frantic voice confirming the miners' advance on the Crooked Creek Pass. Don Chaffin took the call, his face betraying no emotion. He put the receiver down, walked to the porch of his command post, and looked towards the green, silent ridge. He gave a single nod to his waiting runner. That nod traveled down the line, from man to man, until it reached the machine gun nest hidden in a stand of timber. A moment later, the mountain spoke for the first time. It was a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of iron in half, a sound that rolled down the hollows and announced that all negotiations were finished. From his vantage point, the battle was not a scene of chaos, but a grim and terrible piece of machinery that he had designed. He spent his days with maps and binoculars, a general directing his forces. He didn't see individual men fighting for their lives. He saw patterns, movements, and objectives. Through his field glasses, he would watch a line of men attempt to advance through a thicket of trees on a distant slope. He would pick up his telephone, speak a few calm words directing fire to that coordinate, and moments later, the advance would simply cease. The patterns would break, dissolve back into the forest, and the hillside would grow still again. The steady, mechanical rhythm of his machine gun nests became the heartbeat of the battle. It was a cold, efficient, and impersonal sound. Each burst was an argument being made, a final answer to the miners' demands. For 5 days, that sound was relentless. The world shrank to the borders of Blair Mountain. The sun rose and set on the constant thunder of gunfire. Chaffin barely slept, fueled by coffee and the cold adrenaline of a man watching his life's work hang in the balance. On the third day, he unleashed his most terrifying weapon. An unfamiliar sound began to drift over the mountains, the low drone of an airplane engine. From the miners' perspective, it was a horror they could have never imagined. Chaffin's private air force, a pair of rickety biplanes, began making passes over their lines. The explosions in the trees below were often small, the homemade bombs crude and inaccurate, but their purpose was more psychological than physical. It was a message from Don Chaffin. There is nowhere to hide. I rule the land, and I rule the sky. He authorized the use of everything at his disposal. Reports from the miners' side would later speak of bombs that didn't just explode, but released clouds of sickening gas, surplus munitions from the Great War. Chaffin had brought the industrial slaughter of the European trenches to the hills of Appalachia. He was not just defending his county, he was attempting to annihilate the will of his enemy. The battle raged on, a brutal war of attrition. An estimated 1 million rounds were fired. The mountain itself seemed to groan under the assault, its trees shredded, its soil soaked in the conflict. Chaffin's fortress held. His lines did not break. He had met the largest armed insurrection in American history with a wall of fire and steel. Then, as suddenly as it began, it started to quiet. The federal troops were coming, and the miners knew they could not fight their own country. The last shots echoed and then faded, replaced by a profound and chilling silence. The war was over. The argument that had raged for a generation was, for now, permanently settled. Don Chaffin stood victorious on his mountain, the undisputed king of a silent, smoking kingdom. The silence that fell over Blair Mountain was heavier than any sound that had preceded it. Don Chaffin stood in the quiet, the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder still hanging in the air like a ghost. There was no joy in his victory, no triumphant celebration. There was only the cold, hard satisfaction of a man who had met an overwhelming force and had not broken. He had drawn a line, and the world now knew that he would hold that line, no matter the cost. His kingdom was secure. His mind, sharpened by 5 days of constant high-stakes command, did not rest. It immediately shifted from the tactics of war to the politics of the aftermath. His first orders were not to celebrate, but to consolidate. He sent his deputies fanning out across the ridge, their task no longer to fight, but to collect weapons and round up stragglers. He was transforming his private soldiers back into lawmen and the battlefield back into a crime scene. He knew the world was watching, and he needed to control the narrative. This was not a battle, he would claim. It was the quelling of a violent insurrection. The real test came a day later, with the arrival of the United States Army. A column of dusty trucks carrying uniformed soldiers rolled into Logan County, their federal authority absolute. An army colonel, a man accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question, stepped out to meet the sheriff of Logan County. For a moment, two commanders faced each other, one representing the power of a nation, the other the power of a single man's will. This was the moment Chaffin's reign as an independent warlord came to an end. But Chaffin did not surrender his authority. He merely transferred it. He met the colonel not as a defeated man or a renegade, but as a fellow officer of the law. He was dapper, calm, and cooperative. He presented himself as the beleaguered hero who had single-handedly held back anarchy until the cavalry arrived. He offered maps, intelligence, and the full cooperation of his office. He smoothly transitioned from the man who had waged a private war to the loyal local official assisting the federal government. He had won his battle. He had stopped the march. He had broken the miners' army. Now, standing before the might of the United States, he holstered his authority and stepped back into the role of Sheriff Chaffin. His active part in the shooting was over. The road had ended, not in a jail cell or a shallow grave, but in a handshake with the very government he had, for 5 bloody days, effectively ignored. The cost of Don Chaffin's victory was paid in a currency he would never have to touch: the broken lives of the men he defeated and the families they left behind. The war on Blair Mountain was over, but the war on the miners had just entered a new, more insidious phase. As federal troops disarmed the miners, Chaffin's deputies and the state police moved in behind them, armed not with machine guns, but with lists of names. Hundreds of miners were arrested and indicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to murder, and even treason against the state of West Virginia. For the families in the coal camps, the silence that followed the battle was not one of peace, but of dread. A knock on the door of a company shack in the middle of the night meant a husband and father being dragged away to jail. It was followed, almost inevitably, by an eviction notice nailed to the flimsy door. Fired, blacklisted, and homeless, the families of the Union men were cast out, left to fend for themselves in a world where every official, every company man, was now their enemy. The defeat on the mountain was a single event. The suffering it caused rippled outwards for years, creating a quiet, desperate poverty that clung to the hollows like a winter fog. The dream of a Union in southern West Virginia, a dream that had seemed so close, was dead and buried on the slopes of that mountain. Chaffin's victory didn't just crush an army, it crushed a spirit. The United Mine Workers of America was effectively broken in the region for more than a decade. The grip of the coal operators, once challenged, now tightened into a stranglehold. Fear replaced hope. Miners who had once talked openly of their rights now spoke in whispers, terrified that a stray word could cost them their jobs and their homes. Chaffin's system of control was now absolute, reinforced by the memory of what happened to those who dared to challenge it. The tragedy was not just the miners' own, it belonged to the entire community. The battle left scars that divided neighbors and kin for generations. Men from Logan who had joined Chaffin's army returned to live in the same county as the families of the men they had fired upon. A cancer of silence grew over the memory of the battle. It was too painful, too divisive to talk about. Don Chaffin had not just defended Logan County, he had plunged it and the surrounding region into a long, dark winter of fear and submission, leaving behind a wreckage of lives that would take a generation to clear. With the shooting over, the war moved from the mountainside to the courtroom. The state of West Virginia, backed by the full weight of the coal industry, sought to make an example of the defeated miners. Hundreds were charged, but for the leaders, the state chose a charge so severe it was almost medieval: treason. Men who had fought for their country in the trenches of France now found themselves accused of betraying it in the hills of their own home. It was the ultimate clash of cultures, the state's formal written law against the unwritten mountain code of honor and retribution. The trials were a spectacle. The prosecution painted a picture of a Red Army, a Bolshevik mob bent on overthrowing the government and seizing private property. They presented evidence of the miners' military-style organization, their weapons, and their stated goal of marching on Logan. To the state, this was a clear case of insurrection. Don Chaffin and his deputies were presented as heroic defenders of law and order, the thin line that had saved West Virginia from anarchy. But the miners' defense told a different story. Their lawyers argued that these men were not traitors to America. They were patriots engaged in a second American Revolution, fighting against a domestic tyrant. They hadn't marched against the government. They had marched because the government had failed them. They were marching against the state of Chaffin, a private kingdom where the law was a weapon used against them. Their defense was simple and powerful. A man has the right to defend his home and his family, and when the law itself becomes the tool of an oppressor, the people have the right to seek their own justice. The community, and indeed the nation, was fiercely divided. Pro-union newspapers hailed the defendants as heroes and martyrs of the working class. Company-owned papers condemned them as violent radicals. In the coal camps, prayer meetings were held for the men on trial. In the gentlemen's clubs of Charleston and Huntington, they were toasted as villains who had finally gotten their due. The soul of Appalachia was on trial, forced to defend itself in a language it did not fully understand. The most famous trial was that of Bill Blizzard, one of the key field commanders of the miners' army. The state threw everything it had at him. But then, a West Virginia jury, made up not of miners, but of farmers and small-town merchants, delivered a stunning verdict: not guilty. They had listened to the stories of the company guards, the low pay, the beatings, and the assassination of Sid Hatfield, and they could not bring themselves to call this man a traitor. While many other miners would be convicted on lesser charges, the treason trials collapsed. Was justice served? In a narrow legal sense, a jury had acknowledged the miners' grievances. But in the wider world, nothing had changed. The Logan County system remained intact. The Union was shattered. Don Chaffin was still sheriff. The law had rendered a verdict on the battle, but it had remained silent on the long, brutal war that had caused it. True justice, it seemed, was still a luxury the miners of West Virginia could not afford. The army that marched on Logan County did not simply go home. Its leaders were tied up in court for years. Its members were scattered, blacklisted, and broken. The United Mine Workers of America, the great boogeyman that Don Chaffin had waged a war against, was effectively banished from the southern coalfields. In the immediate aftermath, it seemed Chaffin's victory was absolute. The entity that had provoked him into his dramatic stand was, for all intents and purposes, dead. The Union was a ghost, its name only spoken in hushed and fearful whispers in the dark corners of the coal camps. But you can defeat an army of men. It's much harder to kill an idea. The Battle of Blair Mountain, for all the miners' losses, had been a national spectacle. Newspapers across the country had told the story of the private army, the machine gun nests, and the airplanes bombing American citizens on their own soil. The brutal reality of the West Virginia coalfields was laid bare for all to see. Chaffin had won the fight, but in doing so, he had exposed the sickness of the system he was defending. The miners had lost the battle, but they had won the argument in the court of public opinion. The seeds planted on Blair Mountain took a decade to grow, but they grew in the dark. The Great Depression and the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt changed everything. With the passage of the National Industrial Recovery Act and later the Wagner Act, the federal government did what 10,000 rifles could not. It guaranteed the right of every American worker to organize and bargain collectively. The very thing the miners had fought and died for was now the law of the land. In the mid-1930s, the UMWA organizers returned to southern West Virginia. This time, they came not as an invading army, but with the full backing of federal law. They walked into Logan County, the heart of Don Chaffin's old kingdom, and signed up thousands of miners without a single shot being fired. The Logan County system was finally broken, not by force of arms, but by a simple change in the law. The miners' cause, the great antagonist that had risen against Chaffin, had ultimately triumphed. He had won the battle, but history was already siding with the men he had beaten. Don Chaffin had won his war, but he couldn't outrun the changing world. You see, for all his power in West Virginia, he was still just a county sheriff in the eyes of the federal government. His downfall came not from a bullet from a miner's rifle, but from a federal indictment. In 1924, he was convicted of violating prohibition laws, a charge almost laughable in its simplicity compared to the private war he had waged. The man who had commanded an army was brought low by the business of moonshine. He served nearly 2 years in a federal penitentiary. When he returned to Logan, the world he had ruled was gone. His aura of invincibility, once as solid as the mountains themselves, had been shattered. He was no longer the untouchable king. He was a convicted felon, a man who had been humbled by an outside power. He found that the fear he had once commanded had been replaced by something quieter, and the loyalties he had built were shifting sands. He quietly moved his family to Huntington, trading his role as a county warlord for the quiet life of a hotel manager. The king had been dethroned, not by a rival, but by the slow, grinding gears of time and federal law. For his family, the name Chaffin would forever be a complicated inheritance. It was a name of power and prominence, a name that opened doors in southern West Virginia. But it was also a name stained with blood and controversy, a name that was whispered with a mixture of fear and resentment. His descendants would not escape the shadow of Blair Mountain. It became a part of their identity, a legacy they had to navigate, a story they had to either defend or distance themselves from. The name was both a pillar and a tombstone. In the hollows and coal camps of Logan County, the healing was a slow and silent process. The community did not rebuild by confronting the past. It rebuilt by burying it. For decades, the Battle of Blair Mountain was not spoken of. It was a wound too deep, too personal to touch. Fathers who had fought on opposite sides of the ridge raised their children in the same towns, a fragile peace maintained by a collective, unspoken agreement to forget. A blanket of silence fell over the memory of the war, and under that blanket, the resentment and trauma festered. The power dynamic in the mountains had been permanently altered. The era when a single sheriff, funded by private industry, could raise an army and operate as an absolute monarch was over. Chaffin's fall created a vacuum that was filled not by another strongman, but by the slow, creeping influence of the state and federal government. The isolation that had allowed his kingdom to flourish was broken, and the brutal feudal system he had perfected died with his conviction. If you go to Blair Mountain today, you won't find any grand monuments. For the better part of a century, the mountain kept its secrets. The trenches filled with leaves, the shell casings were swallowed by the earth, and the story was buried under a deliberate silence. Then, in the 21st century, a new war for Blair Mountain began. Not with rifles, but with lawsuits and bulldozers, as coal companies sought to strip mine the historic battlefield, to literally erase the history from the landscape. Preservationists and descendants of the miners fought back, a struggle that continues to this day. The ghosts of 1921 are still fighting for their ground. And what of the name Don Chaffin? In Logan County, it is still spoken with a complicated mix of awe and revulsion. To some, he remains the strong man who brought order, the only one tough enough to tame a lawless land. To others, he is the Appalachian Caesar, a tyrant who sold his soul and his people to the company store. You can drive to Huntington and find his grave, a quiet stone marker for a man whose life was a roaring fire. It's a peaceful end for a man who brought so little peace to the world. But his legacy echoes in a way most people never realize, in a word you hear every single day. Think of the word redneck. That word was born in the fire of this conflict. It came from the red bandanas the Union miners tied around their necks to identify themselves as they marched on Logan. It was their uniform, their flag, a symbol of solidarity and defiance against the guns of the coal companies. Before it was an insult, before it was a caricature, it was a badge of honor worn by men willing to die for their rights on the slopes of Blair Mountain. So the ghost of Don Chaffin still walks these hills, but it's not a man in a fine suit with pearl-handled pistols. It's a question. It's the question of how much power is too much, of where the line is between lawman and king, between order and tyranny. His name is a reminder, etched into the very soul of these mountains, that while men die and battles end, the struggle for justice is never truly over. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning. Was Don Chaffin a hero or a villain? The easy answer is to call him a monster, a corrupt tyrant paid to crush the common man. And he was certainly that. But the more unsettling truth is that he was the perfect, brutal instrument of his time and place. He was a product of a lawless system that demanded a strong man, and he played the part better than anyone. He was a king who ruled a county as his personal property, and like any king, he saw a rebellion not as a plea for justice, but as an act of war against his very person. In the end, this is a story about how a man's greatest strength can become the engine of his own tragedy. Chaffin's unbending will, the very quality that made him the undisputed master of Logan County, was the same quality that made compromise impossible and bloodshed inevitable. He was a man who could command an army, but could not comprehend a changing world. He won his battle on Blair Mountain so completely that he ultimately lost the war against history itself, a feudal lord swallowed by the tide of the 20th century. The law eventually caught up to him, but his true judgment was delivered by time. He died a relic, a dethroned king living out his days while the Union flag flew freely over the very mines he had once sworn to protect with blood and fire. His story serves as a dark and powerful lesson from the heart of these mountains, that a man who seeks absolute control will one day be confronted by an absolute truth, that no kingdom and no king lasts forever. And that, my friends, is the ballad of Don Chaffin, a man who believed in the law so long as he was the one writing it. When we think of train robbers, we picture cowboys on horseback chasing a locomotive across the open prairie. But what if the crime wasn't set against an endless sky, but in the pitch-black throat of a mountain? On October 23, 1901, the most luxurious train in Appalachia, the fast-flying Virginian, saw a red signal and slowed to a stop inside tunnel number 19. For the hundreds of sleeping passengers, it was just a minor delay. For the crew up front, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The men who emerged from the darkness weren't romantic bandits. They were something new, more ruthless. So what really happened inside that tunnel? And why has this brutal crime been almost completely forgotten? In the early 1900s, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad was more than just tracks. It was a steel artery pumping life through the heart of Appalachia. It carried coal out of the mountains and brought the modern world in. And the crown jewel of the C&O line was the FFV, Limited, the fast-flying Virginian. This was no grimy freight hauler. It was a rolling palace of polished wood, plush velvet, and gleaming brass, a symbol of progress and prosperity slicing through the ancient, brooding hills. On board were wealthy industrialists, politicians and families, dining in luxury or sleeping soundly in Pullman cars, utterly disconnected from the rugged land they were passing through. This land, the Allegheny Mountains of Virginia, was a world of stark contrasts. Small towns like Jerry's Run were nestled in valleys where life had followed the rhythm of the seasons for generations. But the railroad had changed everything. It brought jobs, money, and a new kind of tension. And it bred a new kind of man, caught between the old ways and the encroaching industrial age. The Flippin and Jenkins brothers were products of this world. George and Charles Flippin, Jack and Gus Jenkins. These weren't outsiders. They were local men. Rumor had it some of them had once worked for the C&O, their hands calloused by the same railroad they now saw as a target. They knew its schedules, its procedures, and its weaknesses. They weren't faceless bandits. They were neighbors, men who understood the land and the steel river that ran through it. They saw the FFV not as a symbol of progress, but as a fat prize, a rolling bank vault just waiting to be cracked. And in the heart of this territory lay tunnel number 19. It wasn't just a hole in a mountain. It was long, it was curved, and it was pitch black. Once a train entered, its engineer was blind to what was on the other side. For the passengers, it was a momentary darkness. But for men with local knowledge and a grudge, it was the perfect choke point. It was a natural trap designed by the mountain itself. And so, on that cool October night, the world held its breath. The luxurious FFV sped through the darkness, a cocoon of light and warmth. Inside the mail car, an express agent named Charles K. Bobbitt went about his duties, guarding the money and securities that were the lifeblood of the region's economy. He was just a man doing his job, unaware that 4 local men were waiting in the shadows, ready to turn his ordinary night into a legend of violence and greed. Little did anyone on that train know, the modern world was about to collide with the brutal reality of the mountains. Just after 10 o'clock, as the FFV Limited thundered towards Tunnel 19, the engineer saw a familiar sight. A single red light glowing in the distance, the universal signal to stop. He did what any railroad man would do. He slowed the massive engine, easing it into the gaping mouth of the tunnel, expecting a simple delay. And that's when the trap snapped shut. Out of the inky blackness, shadows detached themselves from the rock walls. Before the engineer or his fireman could react, armed men were swarming the locomotive. Imagine the terror. In front of them, the suffocating darkness of the tunnel. Behind them, hundreds of sleeping passengers who had trusted their lives to them. And right beside them, the cold glint of revolver barrels in the firebox glow. There was no negotiation. There was no room to run. The robbers' orders were precise and chillingly calm. They weren't interested in the passengers' jewelry or the cash in their wallets. They had a single, high-valued target. At gunpoint, they forced the engineer to perform an act of surgical precision. He had to uncouple the engine, along with the mail and baggage car directly behind it, from the rest of the train. With a loud metallic shriek, the connection was broken. The point of no return had been crossed. The robbers now commanded a ghost train, an engine and a single priceless car, pulling away from the main train and out the other side of the tunnel. The rest of the FFV, with its hundreds of oblivious souls, sat silent and dead on the tracks, abandoned in the dark heart of the mountain, their world of comfort and safety suddenly and irrevocably severed. Isolated from the main train, the mail car was now a steel coffin on wheels. Inside, express agent Charles Bobbitt knew he was in trouble. He heard the commotion, the decoupling of the cars, and he barricaded the heavy doors. The robbers shouted for him to open up. He refused. He was a railroad man, and this car was his responsibility. Their answer came not in words, but in a deafening roar that shook the very mountain. The outlaws didn't waste time on persuasion. They used dynamite. The massive car door, built to withstand nearly anything, was simply gone, reduced to a cloud of splinters and stinging, acrid dust. Through the settling smoke, the gang stormed the breach. And they saw him, Charles Bobbitt, wounded by the blast, but not broken. He was on his feet, revolver in hand, a lone guardian amidst the wreckage. What happened next was not a negotiation. It was a furious, echoing chaos in a cramped steel box. The small space was filled with the bark of pistols and the blinding flash of muzzle fire. It was over in seconds. When the ringing in their ears subsided, only one side was left standing. Charles Bobbitt lay on the floor of his car, a silent testament to a duty he refused to abandon, even in the face of certain death. Stepping over the fallen agent, the gang went to work with cold precision. They ripped open the safes, stuffing canvas bags with cash and securities. Their haul was estimated between $10,000 and $40,000, what would be well over $1 million today. With their prize secured, they didn't linger. Bags heavy with the railroad's lifeblood, they slipped out of the ruined car and melted back into the Appalachian night. The same forest that had birthed them now swallowed them whole, leaving behind only silence, smoke, and a hero lying on the floor. Back in the tunnel, confusion curdled into fear. The passengers of the FFV Limited sat in absolute darkness and silence, a silence that felt heavy and unnatural. When the train crew finally made their way forward through the cars, they found what the robbers had left behind. Nothing. The engine and mail car had simply vanished. It was only when they emerged from the far end of the tunnel on foot that they saw the scene of the crime. There, sitting alone on the tracks, was the locomotive and the brutalized mail car, its door blasted open like a gaping wound. Inside, amidst the wreckage and the smell of gunpowder, they found Charles Bobbitt. Against all odds, he was alive. Riddled with bullets and wounded by the dynamite blast, he was clinging to life with a tenacity that defied belief. He became an instant hero, the man who stared down the barrel of a gun and refused to back down. His survival was a miracle, a small point of light in an otherwise dark and vicious crime. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad was a corporate giant, and this was not just a theft, it was a declaration of war. An attack on their flagship train was an attack on their authority and their very honor. They responded with overwhelming force. Their own police force was mobilized, and they called in the best and most ruthless help money could buy, the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. These were not local sheriffs. They were the infamous strikebreakers and union busters who would later become feared enforcers for the coal barons. They were professional manhunters, and they descended on the Alleghenies with a single-minded purpose. A massive manhunt began. The news spread like wildfire along the telegraph lines that crisscrossed the mountains. A huge reward was offered, turning neighbors into potential informants. The world was changing fast, and the dense Appalachian forests, once an impenetrable sanctuary for outlaws, were now surrounded by a network of technology and law. The gang might have known the woods like the back of their hand, but they were now trapped within them. Fear and rumor swept through the valleys. Every stranger was viewed with suspicion. People whispered stories about the brutal dynamite attack, about the bravery of the express agent, and about the audacious local boys who had dared to challenge the mighty C&O. The Flippin' Jenkins gang had pulled off the perfect crime, but in doing so, they had brought the full weight of the industrial world crashing down upon their heads. The mountains that had been their shield were now becoming their cage. The Appalachian forests couldn't hold them forever. The gang's downfall wasn't a dramatic last stand in a mountain hollow, but a quiet betrayal by the very thing they stole. They began spending the new, crisp banknotes, money that was as traceable in that era as a marked bill is today. Informants, lured by the massive reward, took note. One by one, the Baldwin-Felts detectives, methodical and relentless, tracked them down. Within weeks, the Flippin' Jenkins gang was in chains. Their trial was a major event in the quiet county. The courthouse was packed to the rafters, with a tense mix of curious locals, grim-faced railroad officials, and heavily armed guards. It felt less like a quest for truth and more like a show of force. This wasn't a dispute between neighbors. This was the C&O Railroad, a titan of industry, making it clear that its domain was absolute. The lawyers for the prosecution, funded by the railroad, were sharp and merciless, painting a picture of pure, unadulterated evil. In the defendant's box sat the four men, no longer the masters of the dark tunnel, but pale and exposed under the harsh light of the courtroom. There were no romantic pronouncements, no defiant speeches for the newspapers. By all accounts, they were sullen and defeated. They were local men, known in their communities, now stripped of all power, facing a legal machine they had no hope of overcoming. They were men of the mountains, but they were being judged by the unyielding law of the modern world. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of the train crew, the recovered loot, their own confessions, it all formed an ironclad case. The defense attorneys could do little more than go through the motions. The outcome was never in doubt. This trial wasn't about determining guilt or innocence, it was about delivering a message. The verdict, when it came, was as swift and decisive as the dynamite blast they had used. Guilty on all counts. And the sentence was a living death, life in the Virginia State Penitentiary. There was no glory, no ballad sung of their deeds. They weren't hanged and turned into martyrs. They were simply erased, condemned to fade away into the anonymity of the prison system. So, was this justice? For the railroad, absolutely. For Charles Bobbitt, who carried the scars for the rest of his life, it most certainly was. But for the people watching, it felt like something else. It was the cold, efficient justice of a corporation, a power that could reach into the deepest parts of Appalachia and extinguish any who dared to challenge it. The Flippin' Jenkins gang were violent criminals, but their fate was also a stark warning to everyone in the mountains. The old ways were over. The railroad was king. So what became of the Flippin' Jenkins gang, the men who brought terror to the FFV Limited? They didn't become folk heroes like Jesse James. There were no daring escapes, no ballads sung of their exploits. They simply vanished into the stone walls of the Virginia Penitentiary. They lived out their days as anonymous numbers in the prison system, their names and their crime fading from public memory until they died. Forgotten men paying a long, slow price for a few minutes of violent greed. But what about the true hero of that night? Express Agent Charles K. Bobbitt. His story is the one that deserves to be remembered. He not only survived his horrific wounds, but he became a symbol of courage for the C&O Railroad. The company rewarded him for his bravery, and he continued to work on the railroad he had defended with his life, serving faithfully until his retirement. He didn't seek fame or glory. He was a quiet, dutiful man who, when tested by fire and dynamite, proved to be stronger than steel. And what of the stage for this drama? Tunnel 19 still cuts through the mountain near Jerry's Run, Virginia. The FFV Limited is long gone, a ghost of a more elegant age, but the steel artery remains. Freight trains, the modern workhorses of the railroad, still thunder through that same darkness, their powerful horns echoing in the valleys. For the engineers today, it's just another tunnel, a number on a map. Most have no idea that they are passing through the scene of one of the most audacious and brutal crimes in Appalachian history. But a story this violent leaves more than just physical marks. It leaves a legend. For over a century, a whisper has persisted in the hills around Jerry's Run, the rumor of lost gold. The story goes that the gang, in their frantic escape, managed to bury a portion of their loot somewhere in the dense woods. Even now, locals and treasure hunters armed with metal detectors still comb the mountainsides, searching for a fortune that likely never existed outside of campfire tales. It seems the lure of the robbers' gold has lasted far longer than the memory of the men themselves. The official records may gather dust, but the mountains, they remember everything. So we return to the question we asked at the beginning. Why has this crime, so bold and so brutal, been almost completely erased from history? The answer lies in the crime itself. There was no romance here. This was not a story of noble outlaws fighting a corrupt system. This was a story of dynamite, greed, and a cold-blooded attack on a man just doing his job. It was a calculated industrial crime, born from the soot and steel of a new era, and it didn't fit the clean, romantic narrative of the Wild West that America wanted to believe. The mythology of the prairie, with its wide-open spaces, simply overshadowed the dark, complex reality of the mountains. The story of the Tunnel 19 robbery is a stark reminder that the history of Appalachia is not one of simple hillbillies or quaint folk tales. It's a story of profound and often violent collision between old ways and new technology, between the code of the mountains and the law of the corporation. The Flippin' Jenkins gang weren't cowboys. They were a new breed of industrial bandits, as much a product of the railroad as the coal it carried. And in their swift and ignominious end, we see the raw power of the industrial world asserting its dominance over the old frontier. But if there is a lesson here, it is not just one of cruelty. It's also found in the quiet courage of a man like Charles K. Bobbitt, an ordinary man who, when plunged into the heart of darkness, refused to break. He represents the other side of the Appalachian spirit, not the outlaw defiance, but the deep-rooted resilience, the sense of duty, and the simple, unshakable will to endure. His legacy, though quieter, is far more powerful than any lost gold. It reminds us that true grit isn't found in taking a prize, but in protecting what's entrusted to you, no matter the cost. Imagine a man standing on the gallows, a crowd of thousands watching his every move. He is not pleading for his life, not trembling in fear. Instead, he calmly inspects the hangman's rope and, finding it lacking, reties the knot himself to ensure a quick death. And then, from under the black hood, his own voice rings out, giving the final terrible command to spring the trap. This wasn't just an execution. It was a legend being born in blood and hemp on a hot Kentucky afternoon in 1895. The man was Bad Tom Smith, the most feared gunman in one of Appalachia's deadliest feuds. But was the man who gave the order to end his own life a truly repentant soul? Or was he the ultimate performer, staging his own death to cheat the devil one last time? Today, we will separate the rumors from the facts and find out what really happened on that fateful day. Before the name Bad Tom Smith was ever whispered in fear, and long before blood stained the creek beds, there was a different Perry County. To understand the storm, you must first know the quiet world it destroyed. This was a land carved by God's own hand and forgotten by nearly everyone else. Life here was measured not by the clock, but by the slow turning of the seasons. Mist hung low in the hollows at dawn, the ring of an axe echoed for miles through the dense woods, and the only law that truly mattered was the one passed down from father to son. The people of these mountains were a stubborn and proud stock, descendants of pioneers who had spilled their own blood to claim this rugged paradise. The Civil War had left scars deeper than any ravine, splitting families and neighbors into Union and Confederate camps, wounds that refused to heal a generation later. A man's loyalty wasn't to some far-off government, but to his kin, to his clan. Justice was a personal affair, and an insult to one's family was a debt that would one day be paid in full. They worked the land, hunted for their meat, and asked for little more than to be left alone. At the center of this world, like a great old oak, stood Colonel Fulton French. A Confederate veteran with a commanding presence, he was the patriarch of the old ways. He controlled the timber, and in doing so, he controlled the livelihoods of hundreds of men. He was a man of immense personal loyalty, respected by his allies and feared by his enemies. To his followers, he was the protector of their traditions, the last bastion against a changing world that they neither understood nor trusted. His word was bond, and his authority was absolute. But a new wind was blowing through the mountains, and its name was Joseph C. Eversole. A sharp-witted lawyer and a Union man, Eversole saw a different future for Perry County. He didn't see an isolated kingdom to be preserved. He saw untapped wealth. He saw the thick seams of black coal sleeping beneath the hills and the endless stands of virgin timber. He was the voice of progress, The man who spoke with railroad agents and northern investors, promising them a fortune and promising his followers jobs, schools, and a modern way of life. For a time, these two forces existed in a state of tense equilibrium. They were like two bull elks circling each other, sizing each other up. The conflict played out not yet with rifles, but in courthouse elections, in land deeds, and in whispered arguments at the general store. The county was slowly, inexorably dividing. You were either a Frenchman or an Eversole man. There was no middle ground. Every handshake, every business deal, every marriage was weighed on this scale. And all the while, the true cause of the coming war was drawing closer. It came in the form of men with strange accents carrying surveying equipment, marking lines on trees that had stood for 1,000 years. It came in the form of legal papers covered in fine print that local farmers couldn't read. The outside world had finally discovered the riches of Appalachia, and it was coming to claim them. Little did they know that the modern world would not just be knocking at their door, it would be kicking it down, and the fire it started would consume them all. The dirt of Perry County held more than just coal and timber. It held generations of memory, and much of that memory was written in blood. The first white settlers to push into these narrow valleys were Revolutionary War veterans, given land grants for their service. They were men who had already fought a king and won, and they carried that fierce independence into the wilderness. The land wasn't bought, it was tamed. It was a birthright earned with an axe, a plow, and a long rifle. A man's deed was often written not in ink, but in the memory of his children, a boundary marked by a certain lightning-scarred oak or a bend in the creek. But the deepest crack in this foundation was blasted open by the Civil War. Kentucky, a border state, was a land of divided hearts, and nowhere was the split more vicious than in these mountains. Brother literally fought against brother. When the war ended, the soldiers returned, but the animosity did not. They went back to plowing the same fields and walking the same paths, but now they were forever branded. You were either a Reb or a Yankee. Fulton French had been a colonel in the Confederate Army, a leader of men who fought for the Old South. Joseph Eversole, by contrast, was a staunch Unionist, a man who believed in the power and authority of the federal government. The war didn't end at Appomattox for these men, it just went quiet for a while. The French Eversole War was not a new conflict, it was the Civil War reignited, a smoldering ember fanned into a raging inferno by the winds of greed. The fight over timber and coal was just the surface. Beneath it lay the raw, unhealed wound of that older war, a deep well of bitterness and suspicion that poisoned everything it touched. In these mountains, a family name was a heavy burden, a thing that defined you from the cradle to the grave. It carried a history of pride, duty, and sometimes a legacy of hate. To stand with Fulton French meant you believed in the old ways, in a man's right to settle his own scores without interference from a distant government. It meant your loyalty was to your kin first, your neighbor second, and the law a distant third. To side with Joseph Eversole meant you saw the law as a tool, a way to build a future, and you saw the old clan system as a roadblock to progress. It was a clash not just of men, but of worlds, and the ground had been prepared for it by 100 years of history. Long before the first ambush, the war was fought with whispers. In a place with no newspapers to speak of, and where news traveled by horseback, rumor was a powerful and dangerous weapon. The front porch of the general store, the smoky interior of the blacksmith shop, the churchyard after Sunday service, these were the battlefields. Every land sale, every new hire at the timber mill, every drunken brawl was picked apart and analyzed. Was he one of ours or one of theirs? A simple greeting could be mistaken for a threat, and a cold shoulder could be seen as a declaration of war. Into this poisoned atmosphere stepped the enforcers, the men who turned whispers into action. For Fulton French, that man was Tom Smith. Smith wasn't just a supporter, He was the physical embodiment of French's will. With eyes as cold as a mountain stream in winter and a reputation for being able to shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 100 yards, his presence was enough to intimidate jurors and silence witnesses. He was a walking, breathing threat, the human weapon that kept French's enemies in line. On the other side, Joe Eversole had his own men, often deputized lawmen who used the color of law to serve their faction's interests. The county sheriff himself, a man beholden to Eversole, became a piece on the chessboard, his badge used to harass French's allies and protect Eversole's. The tension had already boiled over in smaller, uglier ways. Just a year before the killing started in earnest, there had been a bitter election for county judge. It was a contest of threats and bribes, not policies. Men loyal to French stood outside polling places, their rifles held casually but with clear intent. Votes were bought with moonshine and promises of work. When the Eversole-backed candidate won by a narrow margin, the French faction declared it stolen. A fistfight on the courthouse steps escalated until pistols were drawn, and only the intervention of cooler heads prevented a massacre right then and there. The incident was smoothed over, but the wound festered. This climate turned everyday disagreements into deadly feuds. A dispute over a line fence between two farmers became a proxy war for the entire county. One farmer was a French man, the other an Eversole man. Soon, the rumor spread that one had deliberately poisoned the other's livestock. Then came the story of a barn being set on fire in the dead of night. There was no proof, only suspicion. But in the paranoid hollows of Perry County, suspicion was as good as a conviction. Friends stopped speaking, families split, and the entire community began to look at their neighbors not as people they'd known their whole lives, but as potential enemies in a war that everyone felt was coming. In the months leading up to the first killing, a deep sense of dread settled over the county, a feeling as thick and suffocating as the summer fog. The old folks, the ones who could still read the signs in the woods and the sky, saw the omens everywhere. A hoot owl, a creature of the night, was heard crying in the broad daylight from a dead chestnut tree, a sure sign that a death was coming to the hollow. The women whispered of dreams of muddy water and of snakes coiled in their path. The mountains themselves seemed to be holding their breath, the familiar sounds of the forest replaced by an unnatural quiet, as if all of creation was waiting for the first crack of a rifle. The human omens soon followed. Strangers began to appear in Hazard, men in city clothes with hard eyes who looked as out of place as a preacher in a saloon. They were hired guns, detectives from the Pinkerton Agency, brought in by Eversole's faction to protect their business interests and intimidate their rivals. They didn't operate by the Mountain Code of Honor. They operated for cash. They carried new, repeating rifles and spoke in cold, clipped tones. Their arrival was a clear signal. This was no longer a local dispute. The power of outside money and industry had now thrown its weight into the fight, and it had brought its own professional killers. This changing tide was felt most deeply by the women. They saw it in the faces of their husbands and sons. They saw the way their men would stop talking when they entered a room. They noticed the extra care being taken to clean a rifle that was already spotless, the quiet stockpiling of ammunition. There was a new tension in the air, a grim purposefulness that had replaced the old simmering anger. A premonition of dread, cold and sharp as a knife's edge, ran through every household. The time for threats and posturing was over. The omens had all been given. The only thing left was for the first shot to be fired. The simmering hatred finally boiled over in the summer of 1887. The spark that lit the fuse was not a land dispute or a drunken brawl, but a calculated public assassination designed to cripple the Eversole faction at its heart. The target was Nicholas Goose Combs, the Perry County Circuit Court clerk and a key lieutenant, as well as a kinsman to Joe Eversole. Combs was the man who controlled the official paperwork, the legal machinery of the county. Killing him wasn't just murder, it was an act of political terrorism. It happened in broad daylight, right on the courthouse square in Hazard. As Combs left the building, a volley of rifle fire erupted from a nearby building. Men from the French faction had laid in wait, turning the seat of county justice into a killing ground. Combs was hit multiple times, falling to the dusty street as townspeople ran for cover in a panic. The assassins made no attempt to hide their faces. This was a message delivered in smoke and lead for all to see. They were declaring that Eversole's legal authority was meaningless, and that the only law that mattered now grew from the barrel of a gun. When the news reached Joe Eversole, any hope for a peaceful resolution died with his kinsman. The grief was immediate, but it quickly hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. This was a direct challenge to his power, his family, and his life. To let it go unanswered would be a sign of weakness that would finish him in the mountains. He would not back down. He would meet fire with fire, blood with blood. The law had failed to protect his man. Now he would rely on his own form of justice. The county fractured overnight. Warrants were issued for the known assassins, but they were worthless pieces of paper. The killers simply melted back into the hollows, protected by Fulton French and his clan. Men who had once gone to town with only a pocket knife now openly carried Winchester rifles. The roads became unsafe, travel between hollows a dangerous gamble. Neighbors who had shared corn liquor now stared at each other over rifle sights. The time for whispers was over. The first drops of blood had been spilled on the courthouse steps, and it was a promise of the river that was to come. A line had been crossed from which there was no retreat. From that moment on, the war was open and declared. The ancient mountain code had taken over completely. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. And Joe Eversole now had a debt to collect. For over a year, the war raged, a series of brutal skirmishes and back-alley assassinations. Joe Eversole, now a hunted man, rarely traveled without a contingent of armed guards. But in the mountains, no man is ever truly safe. On May the 4th, 1888, Eversole made a fateful journey, riding with several of his men along a narrow trail that snaked beside a creek. It was a place where the rhododendron grew so thick it could swallow a man whole, a place perfectly designed for an ambush. The sun was warm, the birds were singing, and for a fleeting moment, it might have felt like peace. But shadows were watching from the ridge above. Without warning, the quiet afternoon exploded in a symphony of death. A single heavy rifle crack echoed from the hillside, sharp and final. Eversole's horse reared violently as its rider was jolted backward in the saddle, his body suddenly limp. Before his guards could even process what had happened, a second volley of gunfire tore through their ranks. It was a perfectly executed trap. The assassins were invisible, hidden behind rocks and trees, firing down into the trail with murderous precision. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, now tasted of gunpowder and finality. One of Eversole's men, a man named Allen, saw his leader pitch forward and fall from his horse, landing in the shallow waters of the creek. The fight was over before it had even begun. The surviving guards returned a panicked, useless fire into the dense woods, their bullets thudding harmlessly into tree trunks. They were firing at ghosts. The men on the ridge held their fire, their work done. They had struck the head of the snake. Joe Eversole, the lawyer, the politician, the man who dreamed of a new Appalachia, lay still in the very land he had fought so hard to control. Among the shadows on that ridge, one man's name would be whispered above all others. While many rifles had fired, the first shot, the one that found its mark with such deadly accuracy, was said to have come from the Winchester of Tom Smith. He was not just a participant. He was the tip of the spear, the instrument of Fulton French's vengeance. He had become the living embodiment of the feud's brutality, a man whose name was now synonymous with death itself. The most chilling image from that day was not one of violence, but of its aftermath. When the gun smoke cleared and the assassins had melted back into the wilderness, all that remained was the unnatural silence. A riderless horse, eyes wide with terror, galloped back towards Hazard. its empty saddle telling the entire story. The surviving guards, stunned and broken, gathered what was left of their leader and began the slow, grim journey back to town, carrying the news that would plunge the entire county into a new level of darkness. The word spread like a fever. They got Joe. Eversole is dead. The news traveled from cabin to cabin, a shockwave of fear and grim satisfaction. For the Eversole faction, it was a devastating blow, a loss that seemed to signal the end of their cause. For the French faction, it was a triumphant victory, a reassertion of the old mountain law. But for the state of Kentucky, it was the final straw. This was no longer a local feud. It was an open insurrection. The assassination of a prominent political figure in broad daylight could not be ignored. The governor called out the state militia, and the full weight of the law began its slow, grinding turn towards Perry County. And at the top of their list of wanted men, circled in red, was the name of the man who they believed had pulled the trigger: Bad Tom Smith. To understand what went through Tom Smith's mind as he lay on that ridge, you must first throw away every modern notion of law and justice. In his world, Joe Eversole was not a fellow citizen with a different political opinion. He was a foreign invader. Eversole was the face of the slick-talking lawyers who used indecipherable documents to steal land from men who could only sign their name with an X. He was the agent of the coal companies that would tear the tops off their sacred mountains and turn their clean creeks black with slag. In the twisted logic of the feud, killing Joe Eversole wasn't murder. It was an act of war, the righteous removal of a mortal threat to his entire way of life. The switch didn't flip for Tom Smith in a moment of white-hot rage. It had been flipped years ago when he pledged his rifle and his life to Fulton French. He was a soldier, and French was his general. His internal monologue wasn't one of hatred, but of cold, grim duty. As he watched Eversole ride into the kill zone, there was no emotional storm. There was only the calm, practiced focus of a master hunter. The wind, the distance, the lead on a moving target, these were the things that occupied his mind. He was an instrument of the clan's will, and in that moment, as he slowly squeezed the trigger, he felt a sense of profound purpose. He was correcting an imbalance, restoring the natural order of the mountains with a single, perfectly placed shot. After the deed was done, there was no rush of guilt, no haunting remorse. There was only the metallic taste of triumph. He had done his job. He had proven his loyalty. He had removed the enemy. For a fleeting moment, lying there in the woods as the echoes of the rifles faded, he might have felt a deep, chilling satisfaction. But that feeling would have been quickly replaced by something else, the cold, pragmatic reality of survival. He was now the most wanted man in Kentucky. His old life was over. He was a ghost, a phantom who would have to live in the deepest shadows of the mountains he had just fought to defend. The satisfaction of the kill was gone, replaced by the grim calculation of the hunted. And that, in its own way, is the most terrifying thing of all, not a man who kills in a fit of passion, but one who does so as a matter of principle, and then calmly deals with the consequences. When the body of Joe Eversole was carried back into Hazard, laid across a horse like a freshly killed deer, a deathly quiet fell over the town. There were no cries of outrage, no shouts for vengeance, just a deep, collective intake of breath. It was the silence of shock, the silence of a people who knew that a final line had been crossed and that the world they had known was gone forever. The gaping wound in Eversole's body was a wound in the heart of the community itself, a tear in the fabric of their lives that could never be mended. For the surviving members of the Eversole faction, grief was a luxury they could not afford. Their leader was gone, but their fight was not. His death did not break them. It forged them into something harder and more ruthless. Vengeance became their new creed. They no longer spoke of progress or the law. They spoke of blood for blood. They organized, armed themselves, and began their own patrols, their eyes burning with a cold fire. They were no longer just a political faction, they were a hunting party, and they had only one prey in mind. But their prey was a ghost. In the immediate aftermath of the ambush, Tom Smith vanished. The mountains that had been his cradle and his home now became his sanctuary. He knew every hidden path, every forgotten cave, every dense thicket where a man could disappear. He moved like a shadow through the deep woods, supported by a network of French loyalists who saw him not as a murderer, but as a hero. They left food for him under designated rocks, passed whispered messages through their children, and met any questions from outsiders with a blank stare and a shrug. Tom Smith was everywhere and nowhere, his legend growing with every failed attempt to find him. The news of Eversole's assassination reached the state capital in Frankfurt like a thunderclap. The governor, tired of the endless headlines about the dark and bloody ground, had finally had enough. This was no longer a county matter. It was an act of open rebellion against the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He called up the state militia. Within weeks, men in crisp blue uniforms, armed with modern rifles and the full authority of the state, arrived in Hazard. They were an occupying army, outsiders who understood nothing of the tangled web of kinship and loyalty that defined the mountains. They were there with a single purpose: to crush the feud and capture the man who symbolized its savagery. The official hunt began. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Tom Smith for the murder of Joe Eversole. His name and description were printed on wanted posters, promising a substantial reward for his capture, dead or alive. These posters were nailed to courthouse doors, general store walls, and any tree big enough to hold one. A price was put on his head, turning loyalty into a commodity and friendship into a potential betrayal. The manhunt wasn't just a legal procedure. It was a declaration of war by the state against the old mountain code, and Bad Tom Smith was now the most famous outlaw in Kentucky. The murder of Joe Eversole was like a boulder dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of fear and hatred spread to every corner of Perry County. The community didn't just fracture, it shattered. The general store, once a place for idle gossip and checker games, became a tense, silent space where men from opposing factions would stand on opposite sides of the room, their hands never straying far from the pistols tucked in their belts. Even the church, the one place that was supposed to unite them, was split down the middle. Families who had worshipped together for generations now sat on opposite sides of the aisle, praying to the same God for the destruction of their neighbors. When the state militia arrived, they expected to find a populace eager for justice. Instead, they hit a wall of silence, a conspiracy of fear as solid and impenetrable as the mountains themselves. These lawmen were outsiders, foreigners, and the mountain people closed ranks against them. Men who had surely seen Tom Smith and the other assassins heading towards the creek that day suddenly developed convenient lapses of memory. Farmers who knew the secret paths through the woods would give the soldiers intentionally bad directions, sending them on useless chases into impassable thickets. This silence wasn't born of loyalty alone. It was cultivated by terror. Everyone knew the reach of Fulton French and his clan. To be seen talking to a militiaman was to mark yourself as a traitor. It meant risking your hay barn being burned in the dead of night, your livestock being found dead in the field, or worse. The fear was a physical presence, a cold knot in the stomach of every man and woman who knew a piece of the truth but was too terrified to speak it. They were caught between the distant threat of the law and the immediate personal threat of their neighbors. Yet, even in this poisoned atmosphere, there were small, quiet acts of courage. A widow, whose husband had been an Eversole man, would leave a jar of milk on the porch of a neighbor she knew was hiding one of the fugitives, an unspoken plea for peace. A doctor, under the cover of darkness, would tend to a wounded man from the wrong side, honoring his oath over the demands of the feud. But for every act of courage, there was an act of cowardice. A man would provide a false alibi for one of the killers, lying under oath to settle an old debt or save his own skin. The feud forced everyone to make a choice, and in doing so, it revealed the true character that lay hidden beneath the surface of their ordinary lives. The hunt for Bad Tom Smith was not a single, organized posse. It was a three-headed beast. First, there were the state militia, disciplined but clumsy. Outsiders who stuck to the main roads and were easily led astray by false trails. Then came the private detectives, the Pinkertons, hired by what was left of Eversole's allies. They were professionals, cold and methodical, who operated with money and informants. But the most dangerous hunters were the third group, the kinsmen of Joe Eversole, mountain men themselves, their hearts fueled by a white-hot need for vengeance. They didn't need a map. The terrain was etched into their bones. And they weren't hunting a criminal. They were hunting the man who had murdered their own. For years, this relentless pursuit played out across the rugged face of eastern Kentucky. It was a grueling, frustrating war against a phantom. The mountains, which had always been Tom's home, now became his fortress. He was a master of their secrets. He could live for weeks on what he could carry in a satchel and kill with his rifle. He slept in rock shelters, where panthers once denned and drank from springs known only to the oldest hunters. The search parties would find his trail, follow it for days through sucking mud and impenetrable laurel thickets they called laurel hells, only to find a still warm campfire and the faint scent of wood smoke on the wind. He was always one step ahead. The chase wore down the hunters as much as the hunted. They were city men in a primal world, plagued by copperheads, sudden freezing rains, and the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig sounded like the cocking of a rifle. Tom Smith became larger than life, a boogeyman the militia whispered about around their fires. Stories spread that he could appear and disappear at will, that the woods themselves were protecting him. In truth, it was the people who were protecting him, the silent, tight-lipped clan who would rather die than betray their own. But time, like water, wears away even the hardest stone. The reward money grew larger, a tempting fortune in a land of desperate poverty. The constant pressure from the state wore down the French faction's resolve. After nearly 7 years on the run, the wall of silence finally cracked. A tip, bought and paid for with state money, led a posse of lawmen to a remote cabin deep in the hills of neighboring Breathitt County. They surrounded the cabin at dawn, rifles ready, expecting a bloody shootout, a final blaze of glory for the legendary gunman. The sheriff called out his name, his voice echoing in the morning stillness. There was a long, tense silence. But instead of a hail of bullets, the cabin door creaked open. A man stepped out onto the porch, blinking in the new light. He was gaunt and bearded, his clothes worn to rags. The fire was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, profound weariness. It was Bad Tom Smith, but he was a shadow of the fearsome enforcer they had hunted for so long. He held no rifle, only a strange look of resignation. The hunt was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs around wrists that no longer had the strength to resist. The trial of Bad Tom Smith in the spring of 1895 was a spectacle. The town of Hazard swelled with people, a volatile mix of the curious, the vengeful, and the fearful. Armed guards from the state militia were posted on the rooftops surrounding the courthouse, their rifles glinting in the sun, a clear warning that any attempt at a rescue or an assassination would be met with overwhelming force. Inside the stuffy courtroom, the air was thick with tension. On one side sat the prosecutors, lawyers from Frankfurt, who saw this as a chance to finally tame the wild mountains. On the other, Tom Smith sat quietly, flanked by his court-appointed attorney, looking more like a tired farmer than a notorious killer. The prosecution built its case with eyewitnesses who had, for 7 years, been too terrified to speak. One by one, men who had been with Eversole that day took the stand, their voices sometimes trembling, and pointed a finger at Tom Smith. They told of the ambush, the crack of the rifles, the fall of their leader. But the defense lawyers were cunning. They attacked the credibility of the witnesses, painting them as biased members of the Eversole faction with their own scores to settle. They argued that in the chaos of the ambush, no one could have possibly identified a single shooter hidden on a wooded ridge 100 yards away. The most damning testimony came from within the French faction itself. Men who had once been Smith's comrades, now facing their own charges or tempted by offers of immunity, took the stand against him. They testified that Smith had bragged about the killing, that he had described it in detail, claiming the first and fatal shot as his own. As they spoke, Smith watched them with a look that was not of anger, but of a quiet, weary contempt. It was the look of a man who understood the final, bitter truth of the Mountain Code. Loyalty lasts only as long as it is convenient. Throughout the trial, Tom Smith himself remained a silent, stoic figure. He never took the stand in his own defense. He watched the proceedings with a detached calm, as if he were observing a play in which he was merely an actor. There was no defiance, no remorse, just a profound and unsettling acceptance of his fate. It was as if he knew, long before the jury did, how this story had to end. After days of testimony, the jury, a group of men carefully selected from a neighboring county to avoid bias, filed out. They returned in less than an hour. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, pronounced the single word, "Guilty." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom, gasps of relief from Eversole's kinsmen, quiet curses from French's. The judge, his face grim, sentenced Bad Tom Smith to be hanged by the neck until dead. There was no outcry, no appeal. This wasn't the justice of the mountains, settled with a rifle. This was the cold, impersonal justice of the state. And it was final. The feud had claimed its last, most famous victim. The hanging of Tom Smith was meant to be an ending, a final full stop on a bloody chapter of Kentucky history. But for the people of Perry County, it was more like a cauterized wound. The bleeding had stopped, but the scar ran deep and ugly. The great French Eversole War was over. The state had won. Yet there was no celebration, no sense of victory, only a profound and unsettling exhaustion. The cost had been too high. For the surviving members of the Eversole clan, justice was a bitter pill. Their enemy's most fearsome soldier was dead, but it couldn't bring back their leader. They had won the war, but lost the peace. Many of them, having looked into the abyss of mountain violence, wanted nothing more to do with it. They had seen what the old ways led to. In the years following the trial, many sold their land and timber rights to the very coal companies Joe Eversole had championed, taking the money and leaving the mountains forever. They scattered to Ohio, to Indiana, to the west, anywhere they could escape the ghosts that haunted every creek and hollow. And what of the mastermind, Colonel Fulton French? He was never convicted for his role in the war. The law couldn't touch him. But he faced a different kind of justice, a slower and perhaps more fitting punishment. The execution of Tom Smith was a public spectacle of his defeat. His power, which had been absolute, was broken. Men no longer feared him because the state had proven it was the bigger, stronger beast. As the coal companies moved in with their railroads and their armies of lawyers, French's old-world influence crumbled. He died years later, not a revered patriarch, but a relic, a bitter old man who had watched the world he fought to preserve be bought, sold, and carved up by the forces of progress he had so despised. It was his curse to live powerless in the ruins of his own kingdom. The community, as a whole, tried to heal itself by deliberately forgetting. The feud became the great, unspoken trauma. It was too painful, too shameful to talk about openly. Parents stopped telling their children the full, brutal story, wanting to spare them the poison of that inherited hate. The tale of Bad Tom Smith and the war he fought in was pushed into the shadows, becoming the stuff of whispers and warnings rather than history. Perry County desperately wanted a new identity. It wanted to be known for its coal, its timber, its hard-working people, anything but the dark and bloody ground where brother had slaughtered brother. A thick blanket of collective silence was pulled over the past, but under it, the memory lay restless and unquiet. Walk through Perry County today, and you will still find the old names. There are Frenches and Eversoles and Smiths living in these hills, their mailboxes standing on the same roads their ancestors bled on. But the feud is a ghost story now, a grandparent's tale told on a cold winter night. The great-grandchildren of mortal enemies are now neighbors, friends, sometimes even husband and wife. The blood hatred has been diluted by time, washed away by a conscious collective decision to break the cycle. They chose peace, and in doing so, they gave their children a future that was not defined by the graves of the past. The physical traces of that war are harder to find, but they are there if you know where to look. There is no monument, no plaque marking the spot where Joe Eversole was ambushed. But drive along the Kentucky River in Hazard, and you will find a quiet, unassuming field. Today, it might be a place where kids play baseball or families have picnics, but the older folks still know it by another name: Hangman's Hollow. The gallows are long gone, rotted back into the earth, but the name remains, a permanent scar on the landscape, a whisper of the day that thousands gathered to watch a man die. In an old cemetery overlooking the town, you can find the final resting place of Tom Smith. There is no grand tombstone, no epic inscription detailing his infamous life or his dramatic death. His grave is simple, almost anonymous, the resting place of a man, not a monster or a legend. It's a quiet, humble end for a life that was anything but. But the real echo of this story isn't found in stone or on a map. It's in the folklore, in the very air of the mountains. The official histories may gather dust in the courthouse basement, but the story of Bad Tom Smith is still alive. It's told by old men on their front porches, a warning about the poison of hatred. And some say, on a dark, moonless night in Hangman's Hollow, if you listen closely when the wind is just right, you can still hear a voice boom out from the darkness, clear and unwavering, giving its own final command. For though people may try to forget, the mountains remember everything. So we come back to the question that hangs over this whole story, a question that lingers in the air like the smoke from that final fatal shot on the ridge. Was the good Tom Smith who stood on the gallows a genuinely repentant soul who had made his peace with God? Or was he the ultimate outlaw, the final act of Bad Tom, a master performer who seized control of his own execution to rob the state of its victory and ensure his name would pass into legend on his own terms? The historical record is silent on this. The truth of it went with him into the dark. It's a mystery locked forever in the heart of a man who lived and died by a code the modern world will never fully understand. But in the end, the state of Tom Smith's soul is not the most important lesson of this story. His life and death are a monument to a bloody and bygone era. This is a story of how the poison of old hatreds, stirred by the coming of industrial greed, can turn a land of breathtaking beauty into a killing ground. It's a testament to the destructive power of blind loyalty, where allegiance to a clan becomes more sacred than the life of a neighbor. But it is also a story of the indomitable and sometimes terrifying Appalachian spirit, a spirit that values honor above life and that can face death not with a plea, but with a command. The great feud is long over. The rifles are silent, and the graves are covered with moss. But the story serves as a permanent warning carved into the memory of these mountains. A warning that the line between neighbor and enemy, between law and vengeance, is perilously thin. It reminds us that the blood of the past never truly washes away. It just sinks into the soil, waiting for a new conflict to bring it to the surface once more. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.